I've always loved the outdoors, the peace, the quiet, and the simplicity that comes with it. So, when my friend Lucas and I decided to go camping in the backwoods of the North Cascades, it seemed like the perfect way to disconnect from the world for a few days. We were both in our late 20s, just two guys looking to unwind and enjoy some solitude in nature. The plan was simple. We'd hike out to a remote spot by the river, set up camp, and enjoy a few days of fishing, hiking, and whatever else we could find to pass the time. The weather was perfect when we set off. The sun was bright, and a cool breeze moved through the trees as we made our way along the trail. The North Cascades are known for their rugged beauty, and as we walked, I couldn't help but admire the way the towering pine trees seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky, their dark needles swaying in the wind. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of pine and earth. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say. It was just us, our backpacks, and the forest. We reached our campsite around midday, a small clearing next to a fast-moving stream that fed into a larger river. The sound of the water rushing over rocks was calming, and it made me feel at ease. We set up our tents, unpacked our gear, and began our fishing rods to see if we could catch dinner. Lucas was the more experienced fisherman, but I was content just to relax and enjoy the setting. The water was crystal clear, and the rocks in the riverbed were smooth, worn down by years of flowing water. It felt like the perfect escape from everything. We spent the afternoon fishing, and though we didn't catch much, we didn't mind. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. By the time we started a small fire, the sky was a soft orange, and the first stars began to appear. We sat around the fire, roasting some sausages and talking about life, the past, and our plans for the future. It was nice, almost idyllic. The fire crackled, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed through the woods. That night, things started to feel different. It was subtle at first, just a slight unease that crept in around the edges of the otherwise peaceful atmosphere. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The wind had picked up a little, but it wasn't enough to make me nervous. The trees swayed, and the sound of the river continued its steady rhythm. But there was something about the way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too long, or the way the distant howls of coyotes sounded just a bit too close. I tried to ignore it, to brush off the growing feeling of discomfort. But as we sat there, the shadows around the fire seemed to grow, as though the night was closing in on us. I glanced at Lucas, but he didn't seem to notice anything odd. He was too busy poking at the fire with a stick, making plans for the next day's hike. "We should get some sleep soon," I said, trying to shake off the odd feeling. "We have a long hike ahead of us tomorrow." "Yeah, sounds good," Lucas replied, his voice calm and steady. But even as he said it, I noticed that he kept glancing around the edge of the campsite, just like I had been. The look on his face was hard to read, but it seemed like he was trying to convince himself that everything was fine. The fire began to die down, and the air grew colder. We stowed our food in the bear-proof container, made sure our gear was safely secured, and retreated to our tents. I was in the tent closest to the river, while Lucas set up in the one on the far side of the clearing. It wasn't far, but the distance was enough to make it feel isolated. The first few hours of sleep were normal, but around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It was faint at first, just a rustle like the wind brushing against the trees, but then I heard it again, closer this time. The sound was heavier, more deliberate. Something or someone was moving through the brush. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise came again, followed by the distinct snap of a twig breaking underfoot. My heart started to race, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was too quiet now. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed to have disappeared. There was only the faint rustle and the occasional snap of branches. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a bear. But the sound didn't have the usual rhythm of an animal. It was too intentional, too human. I sat up in my tent, straining my ears for any other sound. The night was still except for that rustling. It seemed to come from every direction, as if someone, or something was circling the camp. I glanced at my watch. 2:15 a.m. I had no idea how long it had been going on, but the longer it lasted, the more my anxiety grew. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking slightly as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows across the tent. I waited, staring at the entrance, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. No movement, no figure lurking in the dark, just the empty wilderness. I exhaled, trying to calm my nerves. It was probably just an animal, I told myself again. Maybe a raccoon or a large bird. But then I heard something else. An unmistakable sound, one that made my blood run cold. The distinct scrape of something sharp against a tree trunk. It wasn't just a branch or a limb brushing the bark. No, this was something scraping, dragging, like a knife or some other metal object being dragged against the rough surface. My mind raced. What the hell could it be? I grabbed my phone from my backpack, but there was no signal. Not surprising given how far out we were, but still, it made me feel even more isolated. My mind was spinning now. What was going on? I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone here. I slowly unzipped my tent, poking my head out just enough to scan the campsite. The fire was nothing more than glowing embers now, casting faint light across the clearing. There was still no sign of anyone or anything, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I scanned the perimeter, my eyes darting from tree to tree. That's when I saw it. A figure, just beyond the edge of the clearing, near the tree line. It was too far to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. Person, standing perfectly still, just watching us. My heart stopped. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to yell for Lucas, but something told me not to. The last thing I wanted was to alert whoever or whatever that we were aware of them. I slowly reached for my flashlight again, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. I lay back down on my sleeping bag, my mind racing. There was no way I was going to fall asleep now. I kept hearing that rustling, getting closer again. It wasn't just one person. It felt like there were more. I had to tell Lucas, but I didn't want to make any noise. I lay there wide awake, listening for anything that might give me some clue about who or what was out there. Time seemed to drag on. Every minute felt like an hour. The rustling continued, then stopped. Then I heard it, a voice, low, distant, but clear. It was coming from the other side of the campsite, where Lucas's tent was. It was muffled, but I could swear I heard it clearly. Help! My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to move, to go outside, but I couldn't just leave Lucas there alone. I had to act. I grabbed my flashlight and my knife, slipping out of the tent as quietly as possible. The night air was cold and still as I crept through the dark, my mind spinning with every possible scenario. As I reached the edge of the clearing, I saw Lucas's tent. It was still there, but Lucas was nowhere to be found. Then I saw him. He was standing near the trees, his back turned to me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Lucas!" I hissed, rushing toward him. He didn't respond. I grabbed his shoulder, and when he turned around, his face was twisted in confusion. "There's someone else out here," he said, his voice trembling. I swear I heard them too. We both stood there listening, and then I heard it again. The sound of scraping, much closer this time, just behind the trees. We weren't alone, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't going to stop until they found us. We moved quickly, silently, making our way to the trail. It wasn't far, but we knew that we couldn't stay there. The sounds were getting louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was closing in on us. The trees seemed to press in, their shadows reaching out like fingers. Finally, we made it to the trail. We didn't stop running until we reached the nearest ranger station. We couldn't explain everything we'd experienced, but we didn't need to. The look on our faces was enough for them to understand that something was wrong. It's been weeks since that night, but I can't shake the feeling of being watched. It still haunts me, and sometimes I wonder if we were followed. Whoever was out there that night never showed themselves. And the year was 2023, and I was 28 years old when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had always enjoyed the outdoors, but this time, I wanted to experience it alone. No distractions, no one else's company, just me and the woods. The place I chose was a remote area in the Shenandoah National Park, about 2 hours from where I lived in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me, a small tent, a sleeping bag, and the sounds of nature. I packed light, nothing extravagant. A backpack with food and water for a couple of days, a flashlight, a portable stove, a first aid kit, and of course, a map. I had read that the trail I was taking was quiet, barely trafficked by other campers, which suited me just fine. The last thing I wanted was a bunch of strangers around, making noise and disrupting the peaceful solitude I was hoping to find. The weather was perfect as I drove to the park. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was crisp. As I parked at the trailhead and set out, there wasn't a single person in sight. I took a deep breath of the fresh air, glad to be away from the stress of work and daily life. I didn't have a clear plan of exactly where I was going to camp, but I had a general idea of the area. I'd figure it out once I got deep enough into the woods. The trail was easy at first, a well-maintained path that wound through towering trees, the ground covered in thick, damp leaves that muffled my footsteps. Birds chirped overhead, and the rustling of squirrels in the underbrush provided a soundtrack that made the isolation feel comfortable. After a couple of miles, though, the trail began to thin out. It became less defined, the ground uneven, with roots and rocks sticking up from the earth like the hidden bones of some ancient creature. Still, it wasn't difficult to follow, and I pressed on, eager to find a good spot to set up camp. By late afternoon, the sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That was when I spotted it, an opening in the trees just off the trail. It was a small clearing, surrounded by tall oaks and pines, with a soft bed of moss underfoot, perfect for a camp. I dropped my pack and surveyed the area. It was quiet, too quiet. There was no wind, no birds calling, just the occasional distant thud of something moving through the woods. The air felt thicker here, almost suffocating, like the forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the isolation making me paranoid. I set up my tent quickly, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The quiet was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I built a small fire pit, using rocks from around the clearing, and gathered some dry wood to start a fire. As the fire crackled to life, the warmth was a welcome contrast to the chill creeping in as dusk settled around me. I pulled out some freeze-dried meals and made dinner, eating slowly, letting the solitude settle around me. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As night fell, the woods around me seemed to close in. The darkness was thick, and the shadows from the trees stretched long across the clearing. I lay back in my sleeping bag, staring up at the stars, but something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't an obvious presence, more of a nagging sense of being watched. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just the natural unease that comes with being in the woods alone at night. But it didn't go away. I kept hearing faint sounds, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, soft and distant but too regular to be ignored. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and shone it around the clearing. Nothing, just the shadows dancing in the firelight. I shook my head and tried to push the thoughts away. It was probably just a deer or something, I told myself. It wasn't anything to worry about. But as I lay back down, the sounds didn't stop. If anything, they seemed to get closer. The next hour dragged on, each second feeling heavier than the last. Every slight movement in the forest made my heart race, and I kept my flashlight close, my eyes darting between the trees. I was starting to regret this decision, but I refused to let myself get scared. I was a grown adult, a seasoned camper. Nothing was out there. I was just overthinking things. Just as I started to relax again, something else changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the wind seemed to pick up, rustling the leaves in a way that didn't feel natural. It wasn't a steady breeze. It was more like something was moving through the trees, pushing them aside as it passed. I froze. There was no logical explanation for what I was feeling. I had been in the woods enough to know that wind didn't just appear like this. Not in this kind of unpredictable, sudden gust. I sat up slowly, grabbing my flashlight again. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the trees in every direction. But there was nothing. No movement. No animals. Just the stillness of the woods. I told myself it was just a shift in the weather. The wind had picked up, that was all. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The hours dragged on. The sounds of the forest had gone silent, and every creak of the trees or snap of a twig made me jump. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep, my mind racing. I had no idea what woke me up, but I shot up in an instant, heart pounding. It wasn't a sound this time, it was a presence. It felt like something was standing just outside the light from the fire. My stomach churned, and I froze, my mind trying to rationalize what I was feeling. It was nothing, just the stress, just nerves. But then I heard it, a soft footstep, the faintest crunch of leaves, just outside the edge of the firelight. My breath caught in my throat. It was too deliberate, too close to be an animal. It sounded like something was standing right there, watching me. I held my breath, not daring to move. The silence that followed was unbearable. It stretched on, until I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the noise, but the light revealed only shadows. The woods were empty. Nothing was there. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, just my imagination. I had been alone for too long, and the isolation was getting to me. But then it happened again. Another soft step, this time much closer, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I jumped to my feet, grabbing my pack, my heart thundering in my chest. The flashlight slipped from my hand and landed in the dirt. My mind raced. There was no way I was staying here. I had to leave. I didn't know what it was, but something was out there, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what. I grabbed what I could, throwing it into my backpack, and without thinking, I started to run. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Away from the sounds, away from whatever was lurking just out of sight. I ran blindly through the trees, the darkness swallowing me whole. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled through the underbrush, tripping over rocks and roots, not caring anymore. I had to get away. It felt like hours before I finally slowed down. I didn't know how far I had run, but I was completely lost. My chest ached from the effort, and my legs felt like jelly. I had no flashlight, no map, just me and the wilderness. After a few moments of trying to steady my breathing, I sat down against a tree. It was hard to make sense of what had happened. I had never been the type to get scared over nothing, but this was different. I couldn't explain it. My mind kept racing, trying to piece things together, but it wouldn't make sense. The woods were empty. I hadn't seen anyone. There hadn't been any strange creatures. It was just me, running in blind panic for no reason. I decided to wait until the morning. Couldn't do much else. There was no sense in wandering around in the dark. And when morning came, I found my way back to the trail. By then, I had calmed down enough to make sense of it all. I had simply let my mind get the better of me. The sounds, the feelings of being watched, it was all just my nerves. Nothing more. I packed up the rest of my gear and hiked back to my car, the forest no longer feeling like a peaceful escape. The whole experience left me feeling shaken, but as I drove away, I realized that I was glad to leave it all behind. The woods were beautiful, but I wouldn't be going back anytime soon. I went camping alone for the first time in October of 2022. I had done plenty of hiking before, and I'd spent nights at campgrounds with friends, but this was different. This was deep woods camping, solo, far from cell service, far from people, far from anything. The decision came after a long stretch of working double shifts. I was working at a warehouse in Albany, New York, and I was burned out. Everything was mechanical. Wake up, drive, unload boxes, come home sore, fall asleep. I had saved up some time off and figured it would be good to disappear for a few days. Recharge, be alone in nature with no distractions. I didn't want a campground with people or kids running around. I didn't want to see a single other soul. I wanted something quiet, private. A coworker mentioned Groton State Forest in Vermont. I looked it up and liked what I saw. It wasn't totally isolated. There were some trails and lean-tos, but there were huge areas where you could go off the beaten path and really disappear. I marked a spot on the map a few miles from any known trails. There were no official campgrounds nearby, no ranger stations. It looked perfect. I packed enough food and water for 4 days, brought a light tent, sleeping bag, stove, bear spray, headlamp, extra batteries, map, compass, and printed topographic maps in case I lost GPS. I left Albany early on a Thursday morning. It was October 13th. I remember that because I saw it printed on a receipt when I stopped for gas in Bennington. I drove northeast toward the forest and parked off a dirt road at a makeshift pull-off where the shoulder widened. It wasn't an official lot, just a space where a few cars could fit. No signs, no gates, nothing. I left a note on the dashboard with my name, my planned route, and return date just in case. I strapped on my pack and hiked north. The trail I followed for the first mile or so was barely a trail at all, just a path worn down by deer and the occasional hiker. It vanished entirely after about an hour. That's when I turned east and headed into the thicker woods, guided only by compass and the topo map. The trees were thick but not impassable, mostly maple and pine. The forest floor was littered with leaves, slick in some places, and there were small streams crisscrossing the terrain. I had to jump across one or two or get my boots wet. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No traffic, no voices, just the occasional bird or snapping branch under my boots. By early afternoon, I found a flat area near a large boulder where I decided to make camp. It was far enough from any trail that I felt truly alone. There were no fire rings, no trash, nothing to suggest anyone had been there in a long time. I pitched my tent, set up my stove, boiled some water for a dehydrated pasta meal, and sat with my back against the boulder as I ate. The first night was uneventful. I sat and listened to the wind in the trees. As it got darker, the wind died down and it got cold. I crawled into the tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and read for a while with my headlamp on. Eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up a few times to the sounds of branches cracking or leaves rustling outside, but I reminded myself it was just deer or raccoons, common forest sounds. The second day was colder. I spent the morning walking around the area, not really hiking anywhere specific, just getting to know the woods nearby. I marked the location of my camp on the map and took bearings so I wouldn't get turned around. I saw some animal tracks, probably deer and something smaller, maybe fox. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear any planes, no sign of civilization at all. It was exactly what I wanted. That night, though, something felt different. Started around 2 a.m. I was asleep when I woke up suddenly, not from a sound, but from a feeling. It's hard to explain, but I felt like something was off. I laid still and listened. First, it was silent. Then I heard a slow crunch in the leaves outside the tent. It wasn't fast or heavy, just a slow step, pause, then another. Not rhythmic like an animal moving around. It sounded careful, deliberate. The steps moved slowly around the tent. I could hear them circling, one step every few seconds, then nothing. I laid still for a long time. I didn't move, didn't even breathe heavily. Eventually, after maybe 15 minutes of silence, I reached slowly for my bear spray. I stayed that way, frozen, for at least another hour until I drifted off again. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or a porcupine or something else harmless, but I couldn't shake the way it had sounded, like it was trying not to be heard. The next morning, I got out and looked around. I found nothing, no prints, no disturbed ground. It had rained lightly the night before, so the leaves were damp. Maybe whatever it was didn't leave a trace. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I gathered some dry wood and made a small fire to cook over. I didn't wander far. I couldn't shake the unease. I kept scanning the trees. expecting to see someone watching me from a distance. I felt like I was being watched, but I never saw anything. That night was worse. It was just after midnight when I woke up again. This time I heard movement right away, quick footsteps outside the tent. Then silence. Then another fast step, like something running and stopping suddenly. I sat up and grabbed the bear spray again. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to give away my position. I waited, listening. Then I heard a sound like something brushing against the tent wall, near my feet, just a soft scraping sound. I yelled, not even words, just a loud shout. I banged the can of bear spray against my water bottle to make noise. There was a burst of movement outside, quick steps moving away into the woods. I waited, listening. Nothing else came. I stayed awake the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up my things. I didn't care if I still had another day planned. I wasn't staying. Couldn't. I started hiking back the way I came, following my map and compass. I was tired, and the forest looked different in the morning fog. I had trouble finding my landmarks. I tried to retrace my steps toward the road where my car was parked, but something was off. After about 3 hours, I should have hit the stream I had crossed on day one. I didn't. I kept walking, thinking maybe I had drifted west. Then I found something that made my stomach drop. A circle of small stones, arranged in a perfect ring. I had not made that. It wasn't there before. It was fresh. The leaves around it were cleared. Some of the stones had mud still on them. It looked like something someone would do to mark a spot. I backed away and kept walking. I tried not to panic. I checked my compass again. It was working, pointing north as expected. But I had the feeling I was going in circles. Then I saw the boulder, the one I had camped next to. I had somehow looped back to my own campsite hours later, after hiking in what I thought was a straight line away from it. I stood there staring. My boot prints were still around the flattened grass. My fire ring, the patch where the tent had been. I had been walking in circles. I took out the map and sat down. That's when I noticed the missing food. I had buried a sealed bag with a day's worth of meals about 20 yards away from the site, under a marked rock. I did it in case a bear came to camp. But when I checked, the rock was moved. The bag was gone. It hadn't been torn up, just gone. Lifted out clean. I knew then that someone else was out there. Not a bear, not a raccoon. Person. I couldn't think straight. I was tired, hungry, cold. I forced myself to eat what was left in my pack. I didn't even cook it, just chewed it cold, staring at the trees. Then I started moving again. I took a different bearing, due south this time, and moved fast. I ignored the trail I had originally planned. I just wanted out. I hiked until my legs burned. I drank from my water bladder until it was almost empty. The sun was going down and I hadn't found the road. I was thinking about stopping and building a crude shelter when I heard something. An engine, distant but real. I moved toward it and finally stumbled onto a dirt road. It wasn't the one I had parked on, but it didn't matter. I walked the road for a while until a pickup truck came by. I stepped into the middle and flagged it down. The man inside didn't ask many questions. He gave me a ride to a nearby general store. From there, I called a friend who drove out from Albany to get me. I never reported it. I didn't want the attention. I didn't have a name, didn't see a face, didn't even know where exactly I had camped. It was somewhere in the southern part of Groton Forest, but the exact location was a blur now. The one thing I'm sure of, someone else was out there, watching me, following me, taking their time. I've never gone camping alone again. My name is Ryan Keener. I'm 34 years old now, living in a small town outside of Billings, Montana. This happened in the summer of 2016, when I was 25. It's taken me a long time to come to terms with everything that happened during that trip. I used to think if something didn't involve ghosts, monsters, or murderers, it couldn't be that bad. But what happened up in those woods changed how I think about fear. It made me understand that sometimes the scariest thing is just another person. Someone who doesn't follow any rules. Someone who has nothing to lose. Back then, I'd been working at a hardware store for a few years. I didn't have a lot going on socially, and I'd started getting into hiking as a way to clear my head. Eventually, hiking turned into camping. I liked the silence, the sense of being away from everything. I'd done a few weekend solo trips by then. Nothing crazy, just basic overnight setups, mostly in well-maintained areas around the Rockies. By that summer, I wanted something a little more remote. I'd read about a place called Elk Ridge, about 45 miles south of Livingston. It was off most people's radar. No official campgrounds, no bathrooms, no cell service. It wasn't completely off the map, though. There were some old logging roads and trails up that way, and the Forestry Service mentioned it occasionally in backcountry updates. It seemed like the perfect spot to get away for a weekend. I packed light but smart small tent, a couple MREs, jet boil stove, bear spray, a good knife, water filter, basic med kit, flashlight, extra batteries. I brought a topo map and compass too, just in case. I'd planned to hike in about 7 miles along an old ATV trail, then cut north into a patch of woods behind the ridge. There were supposed to be some clearings up that way that overlooked a valley. I wanted to camp there and maybe do a little journaling, take some photos. Nothing complicated. I left on a Friday morning in early August. The drive took a little over 2 hours. I parked my truck in a gravel pullout near an old trailhead that probably hadn't been used in years. The only sign it had ever been maintained was a rusted metal post that used to hold a sign. Beyond that, there was just a narrow, overgrown trail heading into the trees. It was warm, mid-80s, with a bright blue sky and only a few clouds. I started hiking around 10 a.m., moving slowly, stopping to drink water and check the map. The trail was rough, lots of fallen branches, some sections washed out by runoff. It was hard to tell how many people had used it in recent years. Every now and then I'd see a boot print in dried mud or an old beer can someone had tossed off to the side. But for the most part, it felt like I was completely alone. I liked that. It was quiet, peaceful, just birds, wind in the trees, the occasional scurry of a squirrel or rabbit. It took about 3 hours to reach the ridge. I stopped there to rest, ate a granola bar, and looked down into the valley below. It was beautiful, miles of untouched pine forest, the kind that gets darker and thicker the farther you go. I followed a narrow game trail off the main path for another half mile and found a perfect clearing. It was flat, covered in soft pine needles, and bordered by a thick wall of trees. I set up my tent there, gathered some dead branches for a small fire, and got settled in. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, boiled water for one of the MREs, wrote a little in my notebook, and listened to the forest. The sounds of the woods at night don't bother me. If you camp enough, you get used to every snap and rustle. Most of it is harmless: raccoons, deer, small animals moving around. The real threats make less noise. I kept my bear spray close, stored my food in a bear bag up in a tree, and went to bed around 10 p.m. I slept okay, but not great. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why. There was no noise, no movement. Just that weird sense you get when something feels off. I lay there for a while, listening. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside the tent and noticed something strange. There were boot prints, fresh ones, about 15 feet from where I'd pitched my tent. Not mine. These were deeper and wider, like someone heavier had walked through. They came from the trees, stopped near the fire pit, then turned back the way they came. I just stood there for a while, looking at them. They weren't threatening on their own, but the timing was strange. I hadn't heard anything during the night. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. I tried to shake it off. Told myself it was probably a hunter or hiker who passed through and didn't want to bother me. Still, I made some changes. I moved the tent deeper into the trees, maybe 60 yards from the original spot, hidden behind a thicket of brush. I also cleared a ring of dry pine needles around the tent. If anyone came close, I'd hear them crunching. That afternoon, I went for a hike farther up the ridge. I brought my day pack, knife, bear spray, and compass. I didn't plan to be out more than a couple hours. I found some interesting rock formations and a few old tree stumps that looked like they'd been cut decades ago. Around 3 p.m., I turned around and started heading back. That's when I saw it, hanging from a low tree branch at eye level. It was a strip of white cloth, torn maybe from a shirt. It was tied into a loose knot. fresh, not weathered or dirty. I looked around, but there was nothing else nearby, just trees and silence. I took a step closer and noticed something else. The bark on one of the trees had been scratched. 3 long, deep marks, about shoulder height. Not animal marks. These were made with a knife or some other tool. Deliberate. At that point, the uneasy feeling I'd had that morning came back full force. My skin felt tight. I turned around and walked back to camp faster than I normally would, checking over my shoulder every few seconds. When I got back, everything looked normal. Nothing disturbed. Tent still in place. Bear bag still in the tree. But I couldn't relax. That night, I didn't make a fire. I ate a cold meal and sat in the dark. I listened. Every gust of wind made me flinch. Every crack of a branch put me on edge. I didn't sleep much. I lay there with the knife in my hand, bear spray next to me, staring at the ceiling of the tent and waiting for something to happen. At some point around 1 a.m., I heard movement. Slow, deliberate footsteps on pine needles. They stopped about 20 feet from my tent. Then nothing. No retreating steps, no voice, just silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I stayed like that for at least an hour, maybe more. Eventually, the sounds faded, but I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun came up, I packed everything. I didn't eat, didn't waste time. I just loaded my pack, doused the fire pit with extra water even though it hadn't been lit, and started hiking back the way I came. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. No birds, no wind, just that dead forest silence that sometimes comes after a predator has passed through. After maybe 2 miles, I heard something behind me. I turned and saw someone, maybe 200 feet back, just standing there, not moving, not calling out, dressed in dark clothes, maybe a hood or a hat, I couldn't tell. They weren't following directly, but they were in my path, watching. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, trying to figure out what to do. Then I turned and started walking faster, not running, but close. The next hour was the worst part of the whole trip. I kept moving fast, checking behind me, trying to stay on the trail. At some point, I lost the path and had to double back, which cost me time. I could swear I kept hearing branches snapping nearby, always off to the side, never directly behind me, like someone knew not to be seen. I didn't see the figure again, but the feeling never left. I was being hunted, watched, followed by someone who didn't want to be seen, someone who wanted to see what I'd do. I finally reached the trailhead around noon. My truck was still there. Everything looked untouched. I threw my gear in the bed, locked the doors, and drove without stopping until I hit the main highway. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. I didn't report anything. What would I have said? That someone walked near my tent and stared at me from the trees? There was no crime, no proof, just tracks and a piece of cloth, maybe a scratched tree. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I haven't gone solo camping since. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but I don't go deep anymore. Not alone, not off the grid. That part of me, the part that loved being isolated, that part is gone. Whoever that was up there, they weren't lost. They weren't friendly. They were waiting, watching, and I don't think I was the first person they ever followed. I might not have been the last, but I got out, and I won't go back. I was 32 when I took that solo trip out to the hills near Orofino, Idaho. It was early September 2018, just cool enough at night to keep most bugs away, but warm enough during the day to hike without freezing. I'd been working construction jobs in Spokane for the past 8 years, and I'd finally taken 2 weeks off, no calls, no texts, no people. I just wanted some quiet. I'd bought myself a decent tent setup earlier that summer, a 2-person dome tent, weatherproof, and a sturdy old hiking pack I got off Craigslist. It was an older brand, but it held everything I needed and then some. I drove down in my truck and parked just past a little dirt road pull-off near Greer. There was a narrow trailhead I found on a forum, some old Forest Service road that hadn't been maintained since the late 90s. Perfect for solitude. I figured I'd hike in about 10 or 12 miles, maybe more if I felt good. I wasn't planning on seeing anyone out there. Most people stuck to the popular loops near the river. That first day, I hiked for around 5 hours with a break around midday. It wasn't difficult terrain, but the trail was a bit overgrown in places. You could tell it hadn't been touched in years. Some parts were just faded tire tracks with grass and little saplings growing through them. By early evening, I found a little flat area about 40 yards off the old trail. It was near a dry creek bed and backed up against a long ridge. The ridge looked steep enough that no one would be coming over it, and there were just enough trees to offer cover, but not so many that it felt closed in. I pitched my tent facing the trail and set my gear down in a tidy corner. I had my food in a bear canister, and I hung a little tin cup and fork from a tree branch just in case something came sniffing around. It wasn't exactly deep grizzly country, but it never hurts to be safe. The first night was peaceful. I ate some cold chicken out of a vacuum bag and sat with my back against a log, watching the last light bleed out over the trees. The sounds were what you'd expect: crickets, wind, maybe the distant rustle of something small in the brush. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt good. Tired, but in that nice way you only feel when you've walked all day and have no one expecting anything from you. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something snapping in the woods. At first, I thought it was just a branch falling. Happens all the time. But the sound wasn't just one snap. It was a series of slow, steady crunches, like footsteps, heavy ones, maybe 30, 40 feet out past the tent. I laid still, holding my breath. My hand was already on my little flashlight, and I clicked it on, shining it through the tent wall. Of course, that didn't help much. All it did was throw shadows. The sound stopped after a minute. I listened hard but didn't hear anything else. No sniffing, no rustling, nothing. After about 20 minutes, I guess I drifted off again. In the morning, I checked around the tent. No tracks. Nothing moved. The canister and cup were untouched. It was probably a deer or maybe an elk passing through. Still, something about the pace of the steps bothered me. They'd sounded deliberate, not like an animal nosing around. But I let it go. The next 2 days were uneventful. I spent my time hiking along the ridge, trying to find a good view. I didn't go too far from camp, never more than a mile or two. I saw scat here and there, probably black bear. Some fox tracks, too. Pretty standard stuff. One afternoon, I saw a flash of orange in the distance, like a piece of cloth. But when I got closer, it was just a strip of old flagging tape hanging from a dead branch, probably from when the area was logged decades ago. I didn't think much of it at the time. On the 4th day, something strange happened. I was boiling water near the fire pit I dug out when I noticed something in the dirt. A footprint. It was just one, maybe size 11 or 12. Bigger than mine. Not boot tread either, just a smooth sole with no pattern. Like a worn sneaker or maybe a moccasin. But it wasn't mine. I'd been careful to walk in and out of camp on the same path, and my boots left a very clear waffle pattern. This print was different. Shallow but fresh. It hadn't rained, so I could make out the shape easily. I stood there staring at it for a long time. My brain tried to reason it away. Maybe I'd made it and just didn't remember. Maybe it was older than I thought. But it looked clean, clear, and I hadn't seen it the day before. I felt a weird chill crawl up my neck. That afternoon, I walked the area again. Made a slow circle about 50 yards out from camp, looking for more prints. I found 3 more, all facing different directions. One near the dry creek bed, one up on the ridge trail, and another on the far side of a tree near where I'd hung my food canister. None of them made sense. If someone had passed through, where were their other prints? Why no clear trail? And who the hell comes this far out in worn-down shoes? That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept my flashlight in my hand and the zipper on the tent just barely open. The wind picked up around midnight, and the flap of my rain cover slapped against the nylon walls like distant tapping. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to nothing and everything at once. It was like my ears were tuned to the quiet. Every little twig snap felt louder than it should have. Around 2:30, I heard something again. Not walking, this time it was a soft scrape like fabric against bark. Then a slow thump. I clicked my light on and pointed it toward the sound. Of course, through the tent wall I couldn't see anything. I waited. After maybe 10 minutes, I crawled out with my hatchet in one hand and the light in the other. I swept the beam across the trees. Nothing. But when I turned toward the ridge, I saw it, just for a second. A figure. Not close, but not far either. Maybe 70 or 80 feet up the slope, just standing there. I couldn't make out details, just the shape of a person. Upright. Motionless. I didn't move. Neither did they. My light hit them dead on, but they didn't flinch. Then I blinked, and they were gone. I swept the light again, but there was only trees. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just a tall tree trunk. My brain ran through every possible explanation that wouldn't make me feel crazy. I backed into the tent and sat awake until daylight. The next morning, I packed up camp. I didn't want to admit it, but I was spooked. I hadn't seen a soul in 4 days, and now there were prints, noises, and maybe someone watching me. I wasn't going to wait around for it to get worse. I rolled up the tent, sealed up my pack, and headed down the trail. About an hour into the hike, I found something that made my stomach twist. Pinned to a tree with a rusted nail was a strip of fabric. Not old flagging tape. This was fresh. Bright blue nylon, like from a windbreaker. It had a corner ripped off, frayed edges, like it had been torn on purpose. Right beneath it, scratched into the bark, were 3 vertical lines. Nothing else. Just 3 simple gouges. I didn't stop. I picked up the pace and hiked fast, keeping one hand near my belt where I had my knife. By mid-afternoon, I made it back to the trailhead and my truck. Nothing was missing. No flat tires, no damage. I threw my gear in the bed and drove out of there as fast as I could without blowing a tire on the rocks. I didn't file a report. What would I say? That I saw footprints and maybe a person? That someone might have watched me sleep? But I didn't go back. Not to that spot. Not to any spot alone for a long time. That trip changed the way I think about being out there. I still hike, still camp, but I go with others now. And I don't ignore my gut anymore. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. And it wasn't just passing through. It was watching, quiet, patient. And for 4 days, I was alone with it. Sometimes, late at night, when I think about it, I wonder what might have happened if I'd stayed just one more night. My name's Owen Macklin. I'm 33. I grew up in northern Idaho, but for the last 9 years, I've lived in a small town called Willow Bend in central Oregon. It's quiet out here, cheap land, pine trees everywhere. I work from home doing data entry for a logistics company, so I spend a lot of time indoors. Every now and then, I try to get outside and breathe real air. Last year, in late September 2022, I decided to do a solo weekend camping trip. I'd been feeling burnt out, tired of the computer screen. The idea was to head somewhere remote, clear my head, maybe fish a little and just be offline for a while. No emails, no messages, just me and the woods. I planned it carefully. I chose a spot I found online, some local message board. A guy had posted pictures of a small hidden lake he'd camped near, somewhere off Forest Road 18, deep inside the Ochoko National Forest. He didn't give an exact pin drop, but he mentioned that it was about 6 miles on foot from the road, no marked trail, and that the area had good flat ground for tents and was quiet. Said he didn't see another person the whole weekend. That sounded perfect to me. I packed light but thorough. A 2-man tent, just for comfort. My sleeping bag, a foam pad, dry food for 3 days, a portable propane stove, water filter pump, a collapsible fishing rod, knife, small hatchet, first aid kit, flashlight, solar power bank, and a GPS tracker. I left a note with my neighbor who I sometimes chat with, just saying I'd be gone for a few days camping near FR 18, and if I wasn't back by Monday night, to give me a call. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I like to be safe. I'd grown up hiking and camping. I knew what I was doing. I left early on a Friday morning. It was cool and sunny. The weather forecast showed clear skies all weekend. I drove 2 hours to reach the logging road, and about another hour slowly up the gravel Forest Road 18 until I found a good turnout to park. No one else around. I locked up my truck, slung my pack over my shoulders, checked my bearings, and stepped off the road into the trees. The first part of the hike was a little rough. There was no trail, just dense forest with thick underbrush in places. I used my compass and GPS to keep my general direction right. I took breaks every half hour. It wasn't too steep, but the pack was heavy. Eventually, around the 4-hour mark, I found it, the lake. Small, round, tucked into a natural bowl in the landscape. No human-made structures, no trash, water clear as glass. I set up my tent about 50 yards from the lake, under some tall pines. The ground was flat, and there was a little ring of stones someone had clearly used as a fire pit in the past. I smiled. This was perfect. I spent that first evening just settling in. Boiled water for a pouch meal, set up my little camp chair, and watched the light fade over the water. I didn't build a fire, didn't feel like it. Just sat in the cool air, listening to the wind. Around 10, I climbed into my tent, zipped up the door, and passed out. The next morning was quiet. Birds in the trees, occasional rustling in the brush, but no weird noises. I made oatmeal, filtered water, and took my rod down to the lake. I fished for about 2 hours and caught nothing. I didn't care. I was relaxed. I wasn't thinking about spreadsheets or emails or anything except how nice it felt to just sit still. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to explore a bit. I hiked around the lake, maybe a mile total, just slowly taking in the trees and the way the sunlight filtered through them. At one point, I found an old rusted canteen half buried in the dirt. Nothing unusual, just a sign that I wasn't the first person to come through here. I tossed it aside and moved on. Later that evening, I ate, watched the sky go purple and pink again, and laid down to sleep. No strange sounds, no animal noises beyond the usual chirps and scuttles. It was cold, but I stayed warm inside the bag. I don't know exactly what woke me that night. Maybe it was just the cold. Maybe it was instinct. I opened my eyes in the dark and felt tense, like something was off. I lay there still for a few minutes, listening. First, nothing. But then something subtle. A sound like a stick breaking. Not close. Maybe 50 feet out. Then quiet again. I told myself it was probably a deer. Could have been anything. Still, I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and aimed it around through the mesh of the tent. Trees, darkness, nothing moving, no eyes staring back. After a while, I turned the light off and tried to sleep again. I think I managed a few more hours. Next morning, I stepped out and looked around the campsite. Nothing disturbed, no paw prints, no broken branches, just a chill in the air. I shook it off. Probably nothing. I fished again, walked more, took photos, ate lunch by the lake, tried to read a little from the paperback I brought, but something about the atmosphere started to feel less peaceful. It's hard to explain. The place was still beautiful, but I felt watched. Not by anything supernatural, not that kind of watched, but like I wasn't alone anymore. I kept checking over my shoulder, looking into the trees. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't relax. That night, I built a fire for the first time. I felt like I needed the extra light. I sat close to it, poking the embers with a stick, thinking about whether I should just pack up early the next morning. I didn't like this feeling. I wasn't scared exactly, just uncomfortable. When I finally went into my tent, I left my boots right outside under the flap, like I always do. I zipped up, pulled the sleeping bag over my chest, and laid still. I didn't fall asleep right away. My ears were tuned to every sound. At some point, I did drift off, but a sharp noise woke me again. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. It was the unmistakable sound of fabric being disturbed, like my tent wall rustling. Then something heavier, a thump. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the door just a few inches. I flicked on the light and aimed it outside. My boots were gone. Not far, just a few feet to the left on the ground, like they'd been picked up and dropped. I stared for a moment, then unzipped the door the rest of the way and stepped outside in my socks. I swept the light around. Nothing. Just trees and cold air and the faint orange glow from the fire's last embers. I picked up my boots, checked inside each one just in case, and sat down on the camp chair. I kept the light on my lap and didn't go back inside for an hour. Eventually, I went back into the tent and zipped everything up tight. Slept light. Woke early. That morning, I decided to leave. I packed fast. Didn't even cook. Just stuffed things into the pack, rolled up the tent, and took off with a protein bar in my hand. It was just after 7 a.m. I figured I'd be back at the truck by noon, but I didn't find the road. I was sure I was heading the same direction I came from. I used the GPS compass, even the sun. But after 2 hours, I was surrounded by terrain I didn't recognize. A steep ravine, a patch of black rock I hadn't seen before. I stopped and took a long look at the GPS again. The dot was drifting, not matching where I thought I should be. That's when I realized I might have made a mistake. Either the GPS wasn't tracking correctly, or I'd confused my starting point. I took a break, ate a little, and recalculated. I turned back and started walking in what I thought was the right direction. Another hour. Nothing. Still lost. I tried to stay calm. I wasn't completely off the map. The GPS still worked in general. I still had food, water, and daylight. I just needed to reorient. Then I found something that made my stomach twist. A footprint. Not mine. A boot print. Dried in the mud. Deeper than mine. Fresh, maybe a day or two old. Could have been from the guy who posted about the lake. But it wasn't going the same direction I came from. It was off to the side, downhill. I followed it for maybe 100 feet. Then I saw a second, and a third. Then they stopped, right next to a torn piece of cloth hanging from a branch, like a jacket sleeve. That's when I realized I might not be alone out here after all. I turned around, moved fast, back toward the ridge I just climbed down. I didn't run, but I walked fast, breathing hard, sweating now. I stopped checking the GPS. Just wanted to get uphill where I could see better. At the top of the ridge, I paused, took a long drink of water, looked around. Then I saw it. Far below, maybe 200 yards down in a clearing, a tent. Not mine. A faded green one, slumped like it hadn't been used in a while. I didn't go down to check. I turned left and moved parallel to the ridge, away from the tent, fast as I could. Every part of me screamed that something wasn't right. After another 2 hours, I found the road. Pure luck. I burst out of the trees and saw gravel, the side of a ditch, and my truck maybe 200 feet away. I nearly collapsed. I got in, locked the doors, and sat there for 5 minutes just. My name's Eric Langston. I'm 38 years old. I live in Missoula, Montana, and I work as a mechanic. Back in July of 2017, I took a week off to do a solo camping trip up in the Payette National Forest in Idaho. I'd camped in a lot of places in Montana before, but I wanted something a bit farther from home, somewhere I hadn't been yet. I'd read online about a few isolated spots near Cascade, Idaho, places with no cell reception, no crowds, and very few marked trails. That sounded like what I needed. I'd had a rough year. Work had been nonstop. My brother had passed away unexpectedly in February, and I'd been drinking too much, trying to push down the weight of it all. So I figured I'd spend a week alone in the forest to clear my head and get away from everyone for a while. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I packed everything I needed. My old REI tent, a good sleeping bag, food for 6 days, a water filter pump, GPS, and my Ruger .357, which I always bring when I'm going deep into the woods. I wasn't looking to use it, but I've seen enough black bears in Montana to know better than to go unarmed. I drove out early on a Monday morning, leaving Missoula around 5 a.m. The drive was long and quiet. I passed through Grangeville, then dropped south through Riggins. I got to Cascade around 3 p.m. and stopped at a small general store to grab some extra water and jerky. I asked the old guy at the counter if he knew anything about the back roads up toward the East Ridge trails, and he just shrugged and said, "Don't get stuck up there. Ain't no one coming for you." That should have been my first sign. I'd found this area marked on an old topo map I'd picked up at a used bookstore, about 11 miles east of the town, near a place labeled Camp 9. I couldn't find anything online about it, no pictures, no reviews, nothing. But the map showed an old fire road cutting through a patch of dense forest, winding up toward a ridge that overlooked a small alpine lake. It looked perfect. The road was rough, deep ruts, fallen branches, narrow turns. I had to switch into 4WD about 2 miles in. Eventually, around 5:30 p.m., I found a flat clearing near a dry creek bed. No signs of other people, no fire rings, no footprints, no tire marks. Just silence. The forest was thick with lodgepole pines and tamaracks. It was peaceful in a way you don't get in town. I set up camp, staked the tent, rolled out my sleeping pad, and boiled some water for a freeze-dried chicken pasta pack. As I ate, I watched the shadows grow long. The place was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, no rustling. I figured it was just the time of day, everything settling in for the night. That first night was uneventful. Cold, but I had a good sleeping bag. I slept light, though. I always do when I'm alone in the woods. The next day, I woke up early, made coffee on my camp stove, and hiked up toward the ridge. The trail wasn't marked, but my GPS showed I was about 3 miles from a high point that overlooked the lake. The climb was steep. I followed an old deer path, ducking under branches and stepping over logs. By the time I reached the top, the sun was high. The lake below was smaller than I expected, maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by thick trees and a few boulders along the shore. I didn't see any fish jumping, but it looked clean. I sat there for a while, just breathing, listening. Again, no sounds, no birds, no bugs, no breeze. It was strange. I made my way back down around 3 p.m. That's when I noticed something odd. Near the trail, just off to the side where I'd marked a turn with a broken branch, there was a boot print in the dirt. A fresh one. Too fresh. Deep tread, almost new. Not mine, I wear Danners. This was something else. Wide sole, big heel. Maybe size 12 or 13. It was pointing downhill, like someone had come through after me. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. There were no others nearby. Just that one, like whoever made it had stepped off the trail and then vanished. I don't spook easy, but it felt off. I made it back to camp just before sunset and checked the area. No signs anyone had been through. No trampled grass, no moved gear, no broken twigs. I kept my gun close that night, loaded and inside my tent. The second night, I barely slept. Every sound put me on edge. At one point around 2 a.m., I heard a rustle just outside the tent, like someone stepping on dry pine needles. Not an animal, not a deer. It was a single step, then nothing. I held my breath for what felt like minutes. I didn't unzip the tent. I just waited. In the morning, I got out and looked. Nothing there. No prints, no marks. But about 15 feet from my tent, under a tree, I saw something small and shiny. A .223 casing. Clean, not weathered. Fresh. I don't own an AR or anything that takes .223. I sure as hell hadn't fired one out there. I packed up my gear right then and decided to move camp farther up the ridge, closer to the lake. I didn't like the idea of someone with a rifle being near me and not saying anything. I hiked up with everything. Took me about 2 hours. I found a small flat spot about 50 yards uphill from the water and set up again. I figured if someone was messing with me, I'd be harder to find higher up. But that night, it got worse. I was lying in my tent around midnight, gun next to me, when I saw the beam of a flashlight sweep across the trees about 30 yards below my camp. Slow, methodical, like someone scanning the area. No talking, no noise, just the beam moving side to side. I froze. My tent was behind a few rocks, so I was out of sight, but my heart was pounding so loud I was sure they could hear it. The light moved along the lake edge, then turned off. Just gone. No footsteps, no rustling. Nothing. I waited until morning. Didn't sleep. Just waited. At dawn, I packed everything again. No coffee, no breakfast. I just shoved my gear into the pack and started down the ridge. I didn't want to use the trail. If someone was tracking me, that's where they'd look. So I cut cross-country. Slower, harder, but I didn't want to be followed. By noon, I made it to the forest road. I thought I was clear. I was wrong. When I got back to my truck, everything looked normal. No broken windows, no signs of tampering. But when I opened the driver's side door, I saw it. A single .223 casing on my seat, just sitting there like a message. I lost it. I slammed the door shut, scanned the trees, gun in hand. No one, just that same silence. I threw my pack in the bed and got the hell out. The whole drive down that road, I kept expecting a shot to hit the truck. Nothing happened. I made it back to Cascade and called the local sheriff. Told them someone had been stalking me up near Camp 9. They didn't even blink. Just said that area was not recommended and that a few people had come back shaken up in the past. But there was nothing they could do unless someone got hurt. I asked if they'd found anyone out there with rifles if they'd investigated. The deputy just said, "Stay away from Camp 9. That was it. I haven't been camping alone since. I still don't know who it was out there or what they wanted. Could have been a lunatic, a hunter who didn't want anyone near his land. Maybe even someone hiding from something. All I know is this. There was someone up on that ridge watching me, following me, and they were armed. They left no footprints, no tracks, just a single casing each time. Like a message, like they were toying with me. I didn't tell anyone else about it for a long time. Not my coworkers, not my family. But I can't get it out of my head. The silence of those woods, the flashlight beam, the casing on my seat. That wasn't nature. That was a person. And they wanted me to know they were there. I got lucky. I left when I did. I think if I'd stayed one more night, I wouldn't be here writing this. So yeah, the forest can be peaceful, can be beautiful, but it can also be the loneliest, most dangerous place on earth when the wrong person finds you, especially when you're alone, and someone else doesn't want you there. My name's Travis Dean. I'm 33 now, but this happened 7 years ago, in the spring of 2018. I was 26 then. I had just quit my job at a warehouse in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I'd been stacking pallets for almost 5 years. I didn't have any plan, just felt burned out and needed a reset. I've always liked being alone. Camping, hiking, fishing, those were things that calmed me down. So I packed up my little beat-up blue Tacoma with some camping gear, enough food for a week, and headed north into Colorado. I'd been up there once when I was younger, on a trip with my uncle, and remembered the mountains and how quiet everything was. That's what I was looking for. My plan was simple. Find somewhere remote, stay a few days, do some fishing, and think. Maybe figure out what to do next with my life. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. My sister knew I was heading to Colorado, but that was about it. The area I picked wasn't too far from Gunnison. West of it, actually, near a dried-up creek bed called Dead Man's Washington. I found it on an old camping forum online. A guy had posted years ago about how quiet and empty it was. Said he hadn't seen another soul for 5 days. That sounded perfect. The road into the area wasn't maintained. My Tacoma could barely handle the dips and ruts. The last 2 miles took me nearly an hour. No signs, no trail markers, just Forest Service roads that looked like they hadn't been driven in years. Eventually, I pulled into a small clearing surrounded by pine and spruce trees. One big granite boulder sat in the middle like a marker. The place felt still, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I parked under a stand of trees and set up my tent maybe 20 feet from the edge of the wash, which had once been a stream but now was just a narrow, rocky ditch with some dry mud and patches of grass. No water, no sound. Just dry stones and a few twisted cottonwoods with gray bark like dead skin. The first day went fine. I set up camp, walked the area a bit, and cooked some beans and sausage over my little propane stove. The weather was mild, cool in the shade, warm in the sun. At night, the air turned cold fast, probably in the 30s, but my sleeping bag was good enough. The stars were ridiculous, and the only sounds were wind in the trees and the occasional creak of a branch settling. I stayed close to camp the next day. I gathered some firewood, explored the old wash a bit, and tried to fish in a stagnant pool a mile down the wash, but there wasn't a single fish. I noticed some old deer tracks near the water and a few other animal signs. Scat, claw marks on trees, but nothing unusual. No fresh bear tracks, which I was half expecting. I kept my food in a metal canister tied high between 2 trees just in case. The weirdness started that third night. I had just finished eating and was sitting near the fire, poking at the coals with a stick. It was about 9:30 p.m. The fire popped and hissed as the last bits of sap boiled off the wood. I heard something then, Not close, but not far either. Somewhere across the wash, deeper into the woods. It was a crunching sound, like something stepping on dry leaves or twigs. Not an animal sound, not breathing or growling or anything like that. Just a footstep, then another, then nothing. I froze, stick still in my hand, heart suddenly beating harder than before. I listened. Wind moved the treetops, but the ground stayed still. No more footsteps. Now, I've camped enough to know animals move at night. Deer, raccoons, even elk. But this didn't sound like an animal. The steps had a rhythm, a weight to them. Deliberate. I stayed up for another hour, ears wide open, but heard nothing else. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay in my bag, trying not to imagine anything human out there in the dark. Next morning, I found nothing. No tracks. The ground was too dry and hard. Still, I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even two. I tried to shake it off. That day, I went further into the woods, looking for another water source. Carried my day pack, knife, and a little GPS unit I used for tracking my way back. After a couple of hours, I found a shaded gully with water trickling down from some snowmelt. It wasn't much, but it was clean and cold, and I filled up 2 bottles. On the way back, maybe halfway to camp, I saw something odd. A tree about the size of a telephone pole, split right down the middle. Clean split, almost as if it had been hit by lightning, but there were no burn marks, just splintered wood, sharp and fresh looking. Around it were small bones. I don't know what they were from, maybe a rabbit or a ground squirrel, but something had chewed on them, left them in a little pile at the base of the tree. I kept moving, a little faster now, and got back to camp by mid-afternoon. The sky had gone a dull gray, and I felt off. Not scared, not exactly, but unsettled, like something just didn't line up. That night, the footsteps came back, this time closer. It was past midnight when I heard them. Slow, steady steps through the dry grass and twigs just on the other side of the wash. One step, pause, another step, then 2 quicker ones as if someone had adjusted their footing. No breathing, no animal noise, just something walking out there in the dark. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent or grab my flashlight. I just lay there listening, every muscle tight. The steps circled wide, keeping maybe 50 or 60 feet away. Then they faded. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Next morning, I found a footprint. One, just one, in a soft patch of dirt near where I'd left the fire ring. It was a boot print, not mine. Too narrow, and the tread didn't match mine. It looked old but not ancient. No moss, not worn down. That's when I should have packed up and left. But I didn't. Something about it made me stubborn. I told myself I'd imagine the footsteps, that maybe it was some old camper's boot print I hadn't seen before. I even convinced myself maybe it had rained here a few weeks back and someone had passed through. I told myself everything except the truth, that someone was walking around my camp at night, and I didn't know who or why. I stayed a 5th day. I didn't go far from camp this time, just stayed close, organized my gear, cleaned out the truck bed, and sharpened my knife. That night, I built a bigger fire than usual. I put on some music from my phone, set it in a cup to make it louder, and kept the light going as late as I could. Nothing happened, but when I woke up, something had changed. Not at camp, but about 100 feet away, near the tree line. There was a cairn, a stack of rocks, maybe 2 feet high with a feather stuck into the top. I hadn't made it. It hadn't been there before, and it wasn't natural. I stared at it for maybe 10 minutes before walking over. The rocks were all the same size, flat, round stones, too uniform to have been picked at random. The feather was a crow feather stuck point first into the top like a marker. Under the rocks was a smooth piece of wood, almost like a board, maybe part of an old crate or sign. Someone had placed it there on purpose. I kicked the cairn over. I didn't care what it meant or who left it. I was done. I packed up everything in under 30 minutes, shoved it all into the truck without organizing it, and drove out. I didn't stop until I hit the main road 2 hours later, and that should have been the end. But when I got home, back to Tulsa, for days later, I found something under the tarp in my truck bed. I hadn't touched the tarp since leaving. It had just been covering some spare gear and tools I didn't use. Under it, tucked into the corner, was a small flat rock. On it was a mark, 3 lines carved into it like a crude arrow. And under the rock, a single crow feather. I tossed both in the trash. Washed my hands 5 times. Didn't sleep that night. I never told anyone the full story until now. I haven't been camping alone since. I won't even go into the woods by myself anymore. I sold the truck a year after and moved to a second-floor apartment with no yard. Somewhere with streetlights and neighbors. I don't even hike local trails anymore. I don't know who was out there or why they watched me. Maybe they were just messing with me. Maybe they do it to everyone who camps near Dead Man's Washington. But whatever it was, it felt deliberate. Like I was being studied. Like I was some kind of test. And I failed. It was late September 2017. I was 34 at the time, living in Missoula, Montana, working as a mechanic at a small auto shop. I'd been needing a break, something quiet, no phones, no people, no sound of engines grinding through my ears for hours on end. So, I took a few days off work and decided to go solo camping deep in the Lolo National Forest. I've always been into solo trips, especially ones where I can just disappear for a bit and be completely surrounded by woods. I've done it at least once a year since I turned 25. No matter what's going on in life, I make time for it. That year had been hard. My younger brother had been in a car accident in June, and though he recovered, it shook me up more than I liked to admit. Camping was how I reset. I needed this one more than usual. I packed my things the night before. I like keeping my gear ready: tent, water filter, headlamp, tarp, fire starter, compact stove, trail food, bear spray, knife, emergency GPS, everything I've found useful over the years. I took my old black Ford Ranger out that morning around 6 a.m., loaded up with a cooler, extra gas, and my backpacking gear. The air was cold, crisp, and the roads were empty. I drove about 3 hours southwest, past Powell, then off onto forest roads that twisted and broke up into narrow, muddy tracks. My plan was to reach this spot I'd found on a hiking forum months ago. Some guy had posted about a clearing about 10 miles off the road with a tiny, unnamed lake near it, totally remote. I looked it up on a satellite map and it seemed untouched. No trails nearby, no cabins, nothing. Perfect. After 2 hours of slow, bumpy driving through the trees, dodging fallen branches and steering through mud, I reached a dead end near a dry creek bed. From there, I parked and started the hike. I hiked in about 5 miles before I reached the place. It was beautiful. The trees opened into a wide circular clearing about the size of a football field. The lake was still, black and glassy, surrounded by thick pine. There were signs of old animal tracks in the dirt. Deer mostly, but some larger ones that might have been elk or moose. I found a nice flat spot on the south end of the clearing and set up camp. It was around 2 p.m. by then. I pitched my tent, set up a tarp over my cooking area, filtered water from the lake, and stacked some firewood from the dead branches nearby. I always make camp the same way. It gives me peace of mind. There's something comforting about a good setup. The first night was calm. I made a fire, heated up a meal from a pouch, and sat watching the sky fade into a deep purple. I remember the absolute silence. No wind, no birds, no bugs buzzing. Just the faint crackle of the fire. I slept easy that night, curled up in my bag with the tent door cracked slightly so I could feel the cold breeze. The next day, I hiked around the lake, mapping it roughly in my notebook. The far side had a sort of ridge with a shallow incline, giving a clear view over the trees. I spent the afternoon up there just sitting. Around sunset, I walked back down and got a fire going again. I made some coffee, jotted a few notes in my journal, and started cooking dinner. That's when I started noticing something strange. The forest was too quiet. Still no wind, no birds, no animal movement, nothing. I listened hard for minutes. It's not unusual to have quiet stretches in the woods, especially late in the season, but this was different. Felt like everything had just stopped, like even the trees were holding their breath. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. First, I thought I was dreaming. I lay still, eyes wide open, trying to hear it again. Then I heard it slow, steady crunching on the dry leaves. Heavy, deliberate steps. Not fast, not trying to sneak, just walking. I reached for the bear spray and held my breath. The steps circled the tent once, then stopped. I stayed completely still, listening. Nothing. No breathing, no rustling. Just that dead silence again. I don't know how long I lay like that. I must have fallen asleep again eventually, because when I opened my eyes next, it was morning. I stepped out of the tent slowly. The ground around it was undisturbed. No tracks. I did a full perimeter check, nothing. The air smelled of pine and lake water, and I felt like maybe I'd imagined it. I went about my day, trying not to dwell on it. I cooked breakfast and went for a long hike north of the lake. About 3 miles in, I noticed something strange. A tree had been stripped of bark in a tall, straight line, about 8 feet up, like something had clawed or scraped it deliberately. Not like a bear. The marks were too clean, almost like they'd been done with a blade. I looked around and found 3 more trees with the same kind of markings, forming a loose triangle. No signs of tools or metal, just those clean gouges. I marked the location in my notebook and headed back to camp, a little more aware of my surroundings than before. That night, the footsteps came back. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard them again. Same slow pace, crunching leaves, circling the tent. This time, they stopped right behind my head, just outside the tent wall. I held my breath and kept my hand on the bear spray. Then I heard something else. A low, steady inhale, then nothing. No exhale, no more movement. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At sunrise, I got out of the tent fast, bear spray in hand. The ground was undisturbed again. I checked the back of the tent, nothing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something had been standing there, listening. I debated packing up and leaving that morning. My gut told me to go, but I also felt like I needed answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I checked my GPS. I was 10 miles from the truck. If I left now, I could be back by nightfall. But instead, I made the dumb decision to stay one more night. I spent that day exploring farther south. That was when I found the remnants of an old camp, very old. Torn fabric, rusted cans, pieces of rope, a shattered water jug. Nothing that looked newer than 15 or 20 years. It didn't look like a storm had done it, more like it had been trashed on purpose. There were long slashes in the tent fabric like someone had cut it open. The gear had been scattered across a 10-foot area. Some of it had been buried under leaves and dirt. I stood there for a long time trying to piece it together. There were no bones, no sign of people, no ID, no names, nothing. Just ruins of someone else's camp. I went back to my camp with a stomach full of unease. That evening, I packed everything but the tent and essentials. I kept the fire small and went to bed early. I slept with my shoes on and my knife under the mat. Around midnight, I woke up again. No footsteps this time, just silence. Too silent. Then I heard the zipper on my tent move. Just a little, a tug, not a full unzip, just a small, careful pull. I froze. My heart was slamming against my ribs. I grabbed the bear spray, rolled to the side, and waited. Nothing happened for a full minute. Then I heard it again. Another small pull. Then something shifted just outside the tent wall. I kicked hard at the side of the tent and shouted. Not words, just noise. I burst out of the tent with the bear spray ready and spun in a full circle. My headlamp lit up the clearing. Empty. No one. Nothing. No movement. No sound. But the zipper on the tent was half open. I hadn't touched it. I know that for a fact. That was it. I grabbed my pack, shoved everything in, and took off in the dark. I didn't care about leaving the tent or a few supplies behind. I just wanted out. I hiked fast and hard, my headlamp bouncing off trees. Every few hundred feet, I stopped and looked behind me. Nothing, but that feeling never left. Like eyes were on me the whole way. Took me nearly 5 hours to reach the truck. I drove without stopping, white-knuckled, the sun just starting to rise behind the trees. I didn't stop until I was back on a paved road with cell service. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel off Highway 12. I didn't sleep much. My mind kept going over every detail. Those trees, the footsteps, the zipper, the wrecked camp. I even considered calling the ranger station, but what would I say? That someone stalked me silently for 3 nights and unzipped my tent? I didn't go back for the rest of my gear. I didn't even want to. 3 weeks later, I read a short post on a local hiking forum. A guy had gone missing near Powell, not far from where I'd camped. His truck was found abandoned near a dry creek bed. No sign of him, no gear, no body. That was the last time I went solo camping. I still get the urge sometimes to disappear, to find silence, but then I remember that silence and how loud it got when someone was standing behind my tent. My name is Darren Collins. I'm 32 now, but this happened when I was 28, back in late September of 2020. I remember the exact date, September 26th, because it was a Saturday, and I had taken the Friday off to get a long weekend out in the woods. I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time, working as a delivery truck driver, and had gotten used to early mornings, quiet roads, and long stretches of time alone. So camping solo wasn't anything strange for me. In fact, I preferred it that way. The spot I chose was in the Okanagan Wanachi National Forest, about a 3-hour drive from Spokane if you count the winding dirt roads. It's a massive area. Tons of people go there for hiking, hunting, and camping. But if you drive in far enough and step off the main trail, you can easily go days without seeing another person. That was the plan. Just me, my pack, my tent, and the stillness of the forest. I brought everything I needed: a 4-day supply of food, water purification tablets, a sturdy 2-person tent, which is roomier when you're solo, my knife, a small hatchet, my jet boil for making coffee and quick meals, and a weatherproof duffel for my clothes and gear. I also had a Garmin InReach Mini just in case. I don't mess around when it comes to safety, even if I'm going out alone. I parked the truck at a dead-end spur trail, locked it up, and hiked in about 6 miles off the main road. My final campsite was on a slight rise near a shallow stream, surrounded by dense trees on 3 sides. From that little hill, I could look out through the trees to a wide clearing below, a rocky meadow with patchy grass and fallen logs. There were no signs of anyone having camped there recently. No fire pits, no trash, nothing. It felt untouched. I liked that. I spent the first evening setting up my tent, gathering deadfall for a small campfire, and boiling some water for instant ramen. The air smelled like pine and moss, and the temperature was dropping faster than I expected. I had my layers, so I wasn't worried, but I zipped into my sleeping bag early that night and fell asleep to the sound of the stream trickling down the rocks. The first full day was peaceful. I hiked about 3 miles north of camp, just exploring. Saw some elk tracks, spotted a fox, and startled a couple of grouse. I didn't see another human the whole day. The sun stayed out, and by the time I got back to camp in the early afternoon, I was looking forward to a quiet evening. I cooked a freeze-dried meal and watched the sun go down through the trees. Around dusk, I thought I heard something off in the distance. Not an animal, not natural. It was a sharp sound, rhythmic, almost like metal clinking, but it was faint and far off, maybe across the meadow or farther. I stood still for a long time trying to catch it again, but it stopped. I chalked it up to wind or maybe some animal stepping on an old bit of junk left behind by hunters or hikers years ago. You can still find rusted cans and broken tools out in these woods if you look hard enough. I didn't think too much of it. That night, I lay awake a little longer than usual, listening. But the forest went quiet. Just the usual creaks of trees, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. The second day is when things started to get strange. I woke up around 6. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but there was enough light to see the outline of the trees through the mesh of my tent. I sat up in my sleeping bag, stretched, and unzipped the tent to let in the cold morning air. That's when I noticed something that didn't sit right. On the edge of the clearing, down at the bottom of the hill where the tree line began again, there was something on the ground. It was dark, maybe a stump or a pile of something, but I hadn't seen it the day before. I pulled out my little binoculars from my pack and took a look. It wasn't a stump. It looked like a bundle of fabric, maybe a jacket or a tarp. But it was just laying there about 50 yards away, half in the grass and half in the dirt. It gave me a weird feeling, like something had changed in the night and I hadn't noticed. I thought maybe a hunter had dropped it or left it behind. Still, I didn't feel like walking down to check it out just yet. I made coffee and sat by the fire pit, glancing down at the thing every now and then. It didn't move. By late morning, I gave in to curiosity and hiked down toward it. As I got closer, I could see it was a jacket, a heavy-duty canvas one, dark green, covered in dirt and pine needles like it had been dragged. I poked it with a stick. Nothing underneath it. No bag, no gear, just the jacket. I picked it up carefully and shook it out. No name tag, no wallet, no ID. Just torn lining and a busted zipper. It looked old, but not ancient. A couple years, maybe. I left it where it was and walked a bit farther into the tree line, just scanning for signs of anyone. No footprints, no boot marks, no other gear. After about 10 minutes, I circled back and went up the hill to camp. I kept telling myself it was probably nothing. Someone ditched it or lost it. But the forest felt different now, like I wasn't really alone anymore. That night, I didn't make a fire. I just ate a cold meal and stayed quiet, sitting in the tent with the flap unzipped so I could look out into the dark. I didn't use my headlamp much, just tried to let my eyes adjust. It was close to midnight when I heard something again. Not metal this time, not sharp. It was soft, a crunch, then another, then silence. It was footsteps. I know what footsteps sound like in the woods. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I stayed frozen, staring out into the black, waiting. My hand was on my knife, my body stiff. The steps didn't get closer, but they didn't move away either. Then I heard a stick snap, closer, maybe 30 feet from the tent, off to the right near the cluster of trees. I didn't move. I didn't breathe for what felt like a full minute. Then silence again. Eventually, I clicked on my headlamp and pointed it toward the trees. Nothing, just trunks and darkness. I stepped outside and swept the light around the clearing. No movement, no sounds. The air was freezing. I didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, I walked the edge of the campsite looking for signs. I found 2 faint prints in the dirt by the stream. Big prints. Hiking boots, not wildlife. They were facing the tent. No prints leading away, just those 2. The rest had been wiped out by the frost or leaves. I decided I'd leave a day early. Something wasn't right. I packed my gear in a hurry, took down the tent, and started the long hike back toward the truck. I was about halfway, maybe 3 miles in, when I noticed something that made me stop cold. On a tree about 10 feet off the trail, there was a strip of red cloth tied around the trunk. Bright red, like flagging tape, but it wasn't plastic. It was fabric. Torn shirt, maybe. Another 100 feet down the trail, there was another one. Same height, same kind of fabric. This one had a bit of dirt on it, like it had been dragged. My brain went into overdrive. Was someone marking my route? Had they been following me? I kept walking faster now. Every little sound made me stop and look back. The forest was too quiet. I reached my truck just after noon. Everything looked the same. No damage, no signs of anyone tampering with it. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back, and got inside. As I turned the key, I felt this overwhelming flood of relief. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until that moment. I drove straight back to Spokane. Didn't stop, didn't eat. When I got home, I reported what happened to the local ranger station. I told them about the jacket, the footsteps, the prints, the fabric strips. They took it seriously but said it wasn't uncommon to find strange things in the woods. People dump stuff. Hunters get careless. And yeah, sometimes weirdos camp out off-grid. A few days later, I got a call. They'd sent someone to check the area. They found the jacket. They also found more of those red fabric strips, deeper in the woods, all in a pattern. They said it looked like someone had been using them to track movement or mark paths, but no one was there when they searched. No camps, no recent fires, no people. Just markers. The ranger told me I was smart to leave when I did. He didn't say much else. That was almost 5 years ago. I still go camping, but not alone. Not out that far. I stick to areas with cell service and other people nearby. I've learned to trust my gut. When something feels off in the woods, it probably is. What scares me the most is not what I saw. It's what I didn't. Who was out there? What did they want? Why were they marking my path? And why did they stop just short of the tent? I'll never know. But I still think about those footsteps at night, the ones that never came any closer, but never went away either. I've been camping solo for years. It started when I was about 22, right after I left my job at a car dealership back home in Michigan. I'd grown sick of customer complaints, fake smiles, and the way the air always smelled like burnt coffee and rubber in that place. One night, I just packed my hiking gear, threw my tent and some canned food into the back of my car, and drove west. I never really stopped doing that. By the time I turned 34, I'd been to dozens of national parks and forests. I always liked going where most people didn't. I didn't need Wi-Fi, cell reception, or company. What I wanted was trees, sky, dirt, and silence. This trip was supposed to be just like the others. Peaceful, quiet, no drama. I'd picked the Idaho Panhandle National Forests this time. I'd been there twice before, but not deep into the more isolated northern stretch past Bonner's Ferry. That was unfamiliar ground. I'd found an old trail on a blog by some backpacker from 2015. He said it was barely used, maybe 12 miles long, with an old Forest Service road you could reach with a 4WD. No recent info on it. That was part of the appeal. I left early on a Thursday morning in mid-September, hoping to avoid hunters. It had just started getting chilly at night, but not freezing yet. Perfect camping weather. I parked my truck in a gravel pull-off off the old Forest Road 287, about 2 hours off the main highway. There wasn't a single other vehicle in sight. I locked up, threw my pack on, and started hiking. The trail was barely visible. It looked more like animal paths had crisscrossed it than anything people made. I had my Garmin GPS and a laminated map I'd printed out. I also carried a SIG P365 pistol on my right hip, more for animals than anything else. I wasn't paranoid, just cautious. By mid-afternoon, I was deep in the woods. Tall pines surrounded me, and the forest floor was soft with years of dead needles. There was a thick quietness. No planes overhead, no wind, just birds now and then. I set up camp on a flat area near a ridge that dropped down into a gully. I found a nice flat patch for my tent and cooked some beef stew from a can on my small stove. That night, I sat against a log, sipping coffee from my thermos, staring at the stars. I remember thinking how lucky I was to be away from everything. No noise, no emails, no people. I went to bed around 10, but I didn't sleep well. It wasn't anything loud that woke me. It was this odd, rhythmic crunching noise. Not close, maybe 50 or 60 feet out. I figured it was a deer, maybe an elk. I wasn't worried. I kept my pistol within reach and tried to drift off again. It happened again about an hour later. Same kind of noise, leaves, pine needles, steady steps, but never close enough for me to see anything. The next morning, I found nothing near the camp. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing that told me anything had been around. I shrugged it off. It's easy to get paranoid out there alone. Your ears play tricks on you. I hiked another 5 miles that day, deeper into the woods. The trail faded even more. I had to stop often and realign with my GPS. Around 4 p.m., I came across an old fire ring made of stones, probably from years ago. There were rusted cantabs and some charred bits of metal nearby. I decided to camp there for the night. That second night was colder. I wore my base layers and pulled my hat down over my ears. I got the same uneasy feeling around 2 a.m. That time, it wasn't footsteps, but this faint clicking sound, like two rocks tapping together. Slow, then faster, then nothing. In the morning, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. There were prints, boot prints, about 50 feet downhill from my tent. Faint but clear enough to tell they weren't mine. They pointed in the direction of my camp. And then away, just one set. My skin prickled. I hadn't seen a soul for 2 days. I looked around for a while, called out once, even though I told myself I wouldn't talk on these trips. No response. I thought maybe someone else had come through. A hunter maybe, but the prints were off the main trail. Why would anyone be that far out and not make any noise? I sat with that thought for a long time before deciding to keep going forward. Maybe I was being watched, or maybe it was just a leftover track from some other backpacker. But something felt wrong. I started checking behind me every 20 minutes, listening, stopping to look for movement. I'd never done that before. By the third day, I was barely eating. My stomach was always tight, like it was expecting a punch. Around noon that day, I crossed a narrow stream and came to a steep slope. The trees were thinner here, and you could see down into the valley. That's when I noticed movement, just a flash of something dark between the trees across the ravine. Could have been a bear, or maybe just a trick of the light. But then I saw it again. A figure, upright, still, not moving like an animal, just standing. I ducked behind a fallen tree and watched. Whoever it was stood there for a solid minute before vanishing behind a tree. I waited another 10 minutes before moving again, heart thudding the whole time. That night, I didn't light a fire. I set up my tent in a thicker cluster of trees and covered the reflective parts with dirt and leaves. I barely slept. Every sound outside made my eyes snap open. At one point, I swear I heard breathing, not mine, outside the tent. Shallow, careful, like someone trying not to make noise. I held my breath for what felt like hours, my hand on my pistol. In the morning, I packed up and started heading back. I didn't care about finishing the loop anymore. My only goal was to get out. Around midday, I reached a stretch where the trail forked off slightly and looped around a ridge. It was slower going, but I took it, hoping to avoid whatever, or whoever, I'd seen earlier. I made good time until I found something that chilled me worse than the cold air ever could. Piece of paper, stuck to a tree with a small twig, white with a single word written in pencil. The handwriting was uneven, scratched, like someone wrote it fast. My legs locked up. I scanned the forest. Nothing moved, no sound, just me and the note. I ripped it down and kept moving. By late afternoon, the trail was starting to look familiar. I was maybe 3 miles from my truck. I kept my pace fast, almost jogging with my heavy pack. Every so often, I'd hear crunching behind me, faint, then gone. I never saw anyone. The sun started dipping low. The temperature dropped fast. I finally saw the bend in the trail where I'd first come in. Relief washed over me like a wave. I just had to reach the truck. But when I got there, the relief vanished. My truck was still there, but something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. I never leave it like that. My chest went tight. I approached slowly, pistol drawn. The inside of the truck was trashed. Glove box open. Gear strewn across the seats. The lockbox where I kept a backup phone and emergency cash had been smashed. Everything inside was gone. The worst part? Whoever did it left something behind. Piece of rope, cut clean, frayed on one end, sitting on the driver's seat like it had been placed there on purpose. I didn't wait. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and peeled out of there. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station an hour away. I told the clerk what happened. He just nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, that deep out. You get weirdos sometimes." I called the sheriff. They took a report, told me they'd check it out. I never heard anything back. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that. I kept thinking about the rope, the footsteps, the figure, the note. I still camp, but never alone. Not anymore. I stick to trails I know, and I always tell someone where I'm going. The woods used to feel like freedom. Now they feel like something else, something that watches back. My name's Ethan Caldwell. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. This happened to me 3 years ago, in September of 2022. I've never told anyone the full story, not like this, because I honestly didn't think anyone would believe me, and part of me also just wanted to forget about it. But I can't. Not really. So I'm writing it all down, exactly how I remember it. I'd been planning a solo camping trip for a while. I'd been working from home, spending too much time indoors, and I felt like I needed to disconnect from everything. Phones, screens, noise. Just get out into the woods and breathe a little. I'm not a survivalist or anything like that, but I've done my share of hiking and camping over the years, enough to feel confident out there on my own. I chose a place in northern Minnesota called Blackwater Lake. Not one of the big tourist spots. It's a quiet, kind of out-of-the-way lake about 3 hours north of Duluth, surrounded by dense woods and some rough hiking trails. I picked it because it wasn't crowded. I didn't want people around me. I wanted to be alone. That was my mistake. I packed up my gear, loaded my old Subaru Outback, and left early on a Friday morning. I had my tent, sleeping bag, basic cooking stuff, some freeze-dried meals, water filter, extra clothes, a map, compass, first aid kit, bear spray, and a reliable folding knife. I brought my phone too, but I didn't expect service out there. I had printed maps and a Garmin watch with GPS backup just in case. I wasn't reckless. I thought I was prepared. The drive up was peaceful. Cool air, leaves just starting to turn, not much traffic. I made it to the trailhead near the lake around 1 p.m. There was a gravel lot with just one other car, an old Chevy pickup. Probably another hiker or fisherman. I filled out the trail registry and shouldered my pack. My plan was to follow the main trail around the west side of the lake, then cut off toward a ridge I'd seen on a topographic map. It looked like it would give me a good view of the lake below, and I wanted to camp up there for the weekend. No marked campsites, just good old-fashioned backcountry camping. The first few miles were uneventful. Cool breeze, pine needles underfoot, birds overhead. I didn't see anyone on the trail. The forest was dense, mostly pine and birch, with occasional breaks where sunlight hit the ground. I made good time and reached the base of the ridge by late afternoon. The climb was steep, but not too bad. I stopped a few times to catch my breath and drink some water. When I got to the top, I knew I'd picked the right spot. The ridge overlooked the entire southern half of the lake. You could see the trees all the way down to the water, and the opposite shore was completely untouched. I set up my tent on a patch of flat ground, cleared some pine cones, and started boiling water for dinner. I ate, watched the sun go down, and then crawled into my sleeping bag. That first night, I slept like a rock. No noises, no animals brushing against the tent. Nothing. Just silence and wind. The next morning, I woke up around 6. I made coffee and oatmeal, then packed a small day bag to do some exploring along the ridge. The ridge stretched a good 1.5 miles before sloping down toward the east end of the lake. I followed a game trail for a while, found some deer tracks, and saw a few hawks overhead. It was peaceful, but I remember feeling something off around mid-morning. I couldn't put my finger on it, just a weird sense that I was being watched. I kept going, but I started looking over my shoulder more. It wasn't a sound or a movement, just a pressure, like something was out of place. I've had that feeling before, usually when I've come across bear scat or signs of a predator, but this wasn't quite the same. Still, I figured it was just nerves and kept walking. Around noon, I stopped to eat a protein bar and drink some water. I'd reached a flat spot with a partial view of the lake through the trees. I took off my pack, sat on a rock, and leaned back. That's when I noticed something that didn't belong. Off to my right, maybe 30 yards away, there was a structure. Not a cabin, not a shed, just something. I hadn't seen it on the map. It looked like someone had built a kind of crude shelter. Logs stacked between 2 trees, with a tarp stretched over the top and what looked like a fire pit in front. I hadn't heard anyone, hadn't seen smoke. It looked abandoned, but not old. The tarp wasn't faded or torn. The logs were still pale and clean. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. Something told me not to go closer. That same pressure I'd felt earlier came back, stronger this time. I don't know why, but I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like I'd wandered into someone's territory. I slowly backed away, picked up my gear, and walked back toward my own camp. I didn't run, but I moved fast. I kept checking behind me. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept hearing sounds in the woods. Small ones at first, branches snapping, leaves rustling. Nothing unusual, but I couldn't shake that feeling. Around 2 a.m., I heard something heavier. Footsteps, maybe. Not a bear, not a deer. Slow, deliberate crunches of weight on the forest floor. I froze in my bag and held my breath. The sound stopped after a while, and I told myself it was probably just an animal. Maybe a moose, but I kept my knife in my hand the rest of the night. By morning, I decided I was going to cut the trip short. I packed up camp quickly and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I wanted to be out of those woods before noon. About 2 miles in, I realized something was wrong. The trail I was on wasn't the same one I'd come in on. It was similar, and I thought maybe I'd taken a wrong turn, but then I noticed something else. The ground had fresh footprints. Not mine. These were larger. Boots, maybe a size 12 or 13. Deep prints, like the person was carrying something heavy. I followed them for a bit, thinking maybe they led back to the main trail. That was my second mistake. After about 15 minutes, I realized I was heading deeper into the woods, not toward the lake. The trail narrowed, then disappeared entirely. The footprints led off into the brush. That's when I heard it again. Those same slow, heavy footsteps. Not far behind me. I didn't stop. I turned and started walking faster, then jogging. I didn't want to run and make noise, but I couldn't help it. I was scared, really scared. I kept going for what felt like hours, trying to stay in a straight line, but the forest was dense, and I couldn't tell which way was which. I pulled out my compass and tried to orient myself, but nothing looked familiar. Eventually, I found a creek and decided to follow it downstream. Water always leads somewhere. I kept going, slipping on wet rocks, brushing off branches, checking behind me every few minutes. I didn't see anyone, but I never stopped feeling watched. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I hadn't eaten, barely drank anything. I came across a narrow clearing and saw something that made my blood run cold. It was another shelter, but this one was different. It was made from cut wood, not just fallen branches. It had a roof, and inside it looked like there was a table. Not a picnic table, something homemade. There were tools hanging from the trees around it. A saw, an axe, a rusted shovel. I backed away immediately and started moving again. I didn't care which direction. I just needed to get away from that place. The sun was getting low when I finally saw something I recognized. The ridge. I'd somehow looped around and ended up near where I'd camped. I climbed back up, hoping I could find the main trail from that vantage point. When I got to the top, I dropped to the ground and just lay there, breathing hard. That's when I saw the man. He was standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 100 feet below me, dressed in dark clothes, just watching. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, looking up at me. I scrambled behind a rock and waited. When I looked again, he was gone. I stayed up there until it was almost dark. I didn't want to move, but I knew I couldn't sleep there again. I needed to get out. I waited until the stars came out, then used the North Star and my compass to head south, toward where the road should have been. I walked all night, stopping only to drink from my water bottle and catch my breath. I tripped a few times, scraped my legs, but I kept going. Around 4 a.m., I saw headlights. I stumbled out onto the gravel road, nearly collapsing. A truck slowed down and the driver rolled down the window. It was a local, older guy hauling supplies. I must have looked like hell. He gave me water and called the sheriff's office. They didn't find anyone out there. No shelters, no tools, nothing. But I know what I saw, and ever since that weekend, I haven't gone camping again. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but I don't go alone, and I don't go off the trail. Whatever was going on behind Blackwater Lake, it wasn't supernatural. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was just a man, and I think he's still out there, watching, waiting for the next person who thinks being alone in the woods is a good idea. I was lucky. I made it out, but I won't push my luck again. It was mid-October when I decided to get away from everything. The stress from work had built up to the point where I couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes without feeling overwhelmed. I needed to disconnect. So, I rented a small cabin in the woods, about 3 hours from my hometown. The kind of cabin you only hear about in old stories, the ones where you're truly isolated. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just nature and quiet. The perfect place to clear my mind. The drive there was peaceful at first. The trees, starting to show the vibrant colors of fall, lined the winding road, their branches stretching out like arms, trying to touch each other across the asphalt. The air was fresh, and the temperature was just cool enough to roll the windows down. I was looking forward to the solitude, the quiet. I was 28, and I'd never really experienced complete isolation before. This trip was supposed to be my reset. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The place was exactly as described. A small, one-story wooden structure with a stone fireplace and a wraparound porch. It sat on the edge of a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call in the distance. I stepped out of the car, breathing in the crisp air, and felt a sense of calm wash over me. This was what I needed. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The cabin smelled of pine wood and something else I couldn't quite place, like old books, mixed with the scent of damp earth. It was cozy, with a few mismatched chairs around a wooden table, a well-worn rug in the center, and a stone fireplace that looked like it had been used for many winters. The kitchen was small but functional, with a gas stove and an old fridge that hummed quietly in the corner. The place had character. I set my bags down on the bed, which was covered with a faded quilt, and opened the small window beside it. Outside, the woods seemed to go on forever. There was no one for miles, and the closest town was an hour away. The perfect escape. I felt a little buzz of excitement, knowing that for the next few days, I wouldn't have to worry about anything. After unpacking, I decided to make a fire. It took a bit of effort, but soon the flames were crackling, and the warmth filled the cabin. I sat in a chair by the fire with a mug of coffee and just listened to the sounds of the woods outside. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. The silence was thick, and every so often, I thought I heard something move outside. At first, I assumed it was just animals, squirrels or deer, but something about it felt different. I brushed it off as my imagination, settling deeper into the chair. I wasn't used to being so alone. The first night passed without incident. I woke up a few times, the shadows in the room unfamiliar, but nothing seemed out of place. The wind howled through the trees, and the cabin creaked as if it was settling into its own bones. I reminded myself that these were just the sounds of an old building and the surrounding wilderness. It was easy to forget that the world outside was so vast and untamed when all I had was the warmth of the fire and the soft, comforting noises of the night. The next morning, I woke up early, the sunlight streaming through the trees outside. I stretched, feeling the weight of the last few weeks slowly lift from my shoulders. It felt good to not have to rush anywhere, to not have a schedule to follow. After a quick breakfast, I decided to take a walk through the woods. The air was crisp and fresh, and the path was well-worn but not overly trafficked. The leaves crunched under my boots as I walked, the forest enveloping me in its quiet. I could feel the absence of civilization in a way I hadn't anticipated. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed something strange. The path began to feel less natural, like it had been altered in some way. The trees around me grew thicker, their trunks gnarled and twisted, casting long shadows across the ground. There were no animal sounds here, no chirping birds or rustling leaves. It was too quiet. I stopped walking, listening, trying to figure out what was wrong. But the more I stood there, the more I felt like I was being watched. It was a bizarre sensation. I shook it off and decided to turn back. As I retraced my steps, I noticed something odd. A footprint. It was large, and it seemed to have been made recently, the dirt still slightly disturbed. I crouched down to get a closer look. It wasn't the kind of print I was used to seeing in the woods. No bear or deer tracks, just a large, round indentation in the earth, almost like a boot print but too big for any boot I'd ever seen. I stood up quickly, a feeling of unease creeping up my spine. I hadn't noticed when it had gotten so quiet again, but now the silence seemed louder than before. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart starting to race. When I arrived, I locked the door behind me, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I was in a cabin in the middle of the woods. Of course, I was going to get jumpy. But something told me it wasn't just that. That afternoon, I spent some time reading in front of the fire. I kept my phone turned off, and for a while, I almost forgot about the strange feeling in the woods. But as night fell, the unease returned. The shadows outside seemed darker, deeper, and the wind had picked up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Someone was outside. The faint crunch of footsteps on the leaves, soft but distinct. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped, and I sat in the dark, waiting, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it started again, closer this time. The steps were slow, deliberate, as if whoever it was knew I was awake. I didn't know what to do. I considered grabbing a weapon, but I didn't have anything nearby. The fireplace poker was too far away. I silently moved to the window and peered out through the small gap between the curtains. But there was nothing. The clearing outside was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I stayed up for the rest of the night, listening for any sounds. Every little creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, made my heart skip a beat. But as the hours passed, nothing happened. The footsteps, if they had been real, had stopped. By morning, I had convinced myself that I had imagined it. I hadn't slept, but I had to leave the cabin. I had to get out. I packed my things quickly, barely taking the time to double-check the cabin. As I walked out onto the porch, I glanced around one last time. The woods were still quiet. But then, just as I was about to get into my car, I noticed something. The same footprint from yesterday was just outside the door. But now there were more, dozens of them. They circled the cabin, leading into the trees and then disappearing. They were fresh, the edges still sharp. I didn't hesitate. I got in my car and drove off, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I didn't look back. I was 34 when I decided to take some time off work. I'd been working long weeks for over a year straight, deadlines, meetings, constant emails. It was in early October, just before the heavy snows would usually start in the upper parts of Oregon. My mind was fried from city noise, the constant buzz of traffic and sirens. I needed a break. I didn't want a resort or some popular Airbnb spot. I wanted total silence, real distance from everything. No cell service, no people, just quiet. I wanted to feel far from it all. After looking around on some lesser-known forums and listings, I found a privately owned cabin that an older couple rented out just outside of a place called Granite Ridge, around 5,200 feet up in the Blue Mountains. It wasn't anything fancy, just a 2-room wooden structure with no electricity and a small wood stove. There was a creek nearby, a decent view of the slope, and it was surrounded by thick forest. The listing was honest. No internet, no phone signal, no nearby stores, nothing for about 20 miles. Just pure isolation. That's exactly what I wanted. I brought a few things. A week's worth of freeze-dried meals, bottled water, firewood. Even though the cabin had its own stash, a small gas stove, 2 power banks, a heavy-duty flashlight, a camp axe, a compass, a waterproof map of the area, and a journal. I packed all of it into the back of my Subaru and made the drive from Portland in about 6 hours, hitting the gravel forest road just after noon. The trees were already turning yellow and red. It was cold enough for breath to show in the morning, but warm enough to hike without a coat during the day. Perfect. I arrived at the cabin around 3:30 in the afternoon. It sat back off the narrow trail, hidden pretty well by trees. There was a small clearing with a rusty metal fire pit, a pile of stacked wood, and a log bench. The cabin itself looked solid, weathered, sure, but not falling apart. 2 small windows, one on the front and one on the side, both with wooden shutters. No locks on the doors, just a heavy latch and a thick wooden beam you could drop across the inside if you wanted to feel secure. Inside, it was cozy. A cot with a thick sleeping bag, shelves with some canned food, matches, candles, a cast iron pan, a water jug, and a little journal where previous guests had written short notes. I skimmed a few of the entries. Mostly people thanking the owners, talking about the peace and quiet, a few funny comments about mice. Nothing strange. I unpacked, lit a small fire in the stove to warm the room, and made some instant coffee. That first night was the kind of silence I hadn't heard in years. No humming appliances, no car doors, no voices. Just the creak of the trees outside when the wind picked up. I fell asleep early, probably around 8:30, and didn't wake up once until the sun came through the shutter cracks the next morning. The next couple of days were everything I'd hoped for. I hiked around the ridge, took notes in my journal, read a paperback I'd brought. On the third day, I hiked out a little farther, down into a lower valley. I followed the creek, looking for signs of elk or deer. I brought my compass and marked a few trees with chalk to keep track of where I'd come from. I didn't see any animals, but I found what looked like an old fence line, half-buried posts, rusted wire. It looked like someone had tried to fence off an area a long time ago. The trees there were a little younger, like maybe there'd been some kind of clearing that had since grown back in. There were some boot prints around the edge of the creek, but they looked old. The ground was dry enough that nothing fresh would have stayed long, but it still caught my attention. They weren't mine. They were from a heavy tread, maybe work boots, not hiking shoes, probably hunters or someone who'd been through before me. I went back to the cabin around 4 p.m., started a fire, and made some soup. It was starting to get colder. I sat outside for a while, just watching the sun drop behind the ridge. That's when I noticed something weird. I always kept my gear organized in the cabin, just the way I packed it. Flashlight on the right side of the shelf. Batteries in the red pouch. My knife handle turned facing out. That night, when I went to get my flashlight, it wasn't where I'd left it. It was in the middle of the shelf, sitting on top of the pouch instead of next to it. I paused, stared at it, tried to think if I'd moved it and forgot, but I was pretty sure I hadn't. I'd only used it the night before, and I remembered setting it back exactly where it belonged. I didn't panic, just chalked it up to forgetfulness, but it bothered me enough that I checked the door latch. Still locked from the inside. No signs anyone had been in. Still, I moved my gear into a duffel bag and set it right next to my cot that night. I left the axe near the door, just in case. I slept with the wooden beam locked in place. The next morning, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I chopped a little wood, filled up my water containers, and read most of the day. Around 2 p.m., I walked a short loop around the cabin, maybe a half-mile radius, just to get my blood moving. That's when I saw something that didn't make sense. About 200 feet from the cabin, uphill along the tree line, I saw what looked like a tin can sitting on the ground. It was an old stew can, the kind with the pull-tab top. I walked over and picked it up. No rust, barely any dirt. It had been opened recently. I didn't bring any canned stew. I only brought freeze-dried meals and a few tuna pouches. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. It had a tiny bit of food still crusted around the edges. Someone had been there. Recently, I made a wide loop back to the cabin, checking the brush for signs of movement. Nothing. No obvious tracks, no noises. I went back inside, shut the shutters, and started a fire even though it was still light out. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. Every little crack in the wood, every gust of wind outside made me flinch. I kept thinking about that can. I kept thinking about the prints near the creek. I stayed in the cot, flashlight in one hand, axe in the other. Around 3:30 in the morning, I heard what I thought was a branch snap outside. Just one. Not wind. Clean, dry snap. I didn't move, didn't breathe. It didn't happen again. The sun came up slow, but I was already packed by then. I decided I'd leave early, cut my week short by a day or two. I'd gotten what I needed out of the trip anyway. Some silence, some clarity. That was enough. But when I opened the door, I saw something that made my stomach turn. On the log bench just outside the cabin, there was a strip of cloth. Blue, dirty, frayed at the edges. It looked like the sleeve from a jacket. I didn't have anything blue. I hadn't seen any trash like that when I arrived. It hadn't been there the day before. I stared at it for maybe a full minute, trying to decide what to do. I thought about grabbing it and checking it closer, but something about it felt off, like I wasn't meant to see it, like it had been left there, deliberately. I didn't even eat breakfast. I stuffed everything into my backpack, doused the fire, and got in the car. I started driving back down the gravel road, going slower than I wanted because of the deep ruts. Every 100 feet or so, I checked my rearview mirror. There was nothing back there. No cars, no shapes, just the trees. It wasn't until I was almost 10 miles from the cabin that I saw the second thing that shook me. On the left side of the road, just inside the tree line, there was another can. Same brand, same kind of stew, sitting upright on a tree stump like it had been placed there. I didn't stop, didn't get out, just kept driving. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't know how to explain it. Nothing actually happened. No one attacked me. I wasn't chased. I didn't find any bodies or weapons, but I knew someone had been out there, watching, close enough to move things inside the cabin, close enough to leave things behind. It wasn't until about a year later that I found a thread on a hiking forum about the Granite Ridge area. Someone had mentioned old hunting cabins. Someone else replied with a warning, said there were a few weird stories. Not about ghosts, not about monsters, just about people. Strange campers, people who didn't want company. A guy mentioned finding his firewood rearranged in the middle of the night. Another said he woke up and all the candles in his cabin had been taken. Nothing else, just the candles. I never went back. I deleted the cabin owner's contact information, threw away the map I'd used, burned the journal pages I'd written while I was there. That trip did clear my head, though, just not in the way I expected. I realized there are parts of the world where people live without rules, people who don't want to be found, people who notice when someone's close. And sometimes, if you're not paying attention, they let you know they've seen you. Sometimes that's the only warning you get. I was 31 the year I decided to disappear for a while. Not from anything dramatic, not from the law or someone chasing me. I was just tired. I'd worked construction for most of my 20s, long shifts under the sun, dealing with supervisors who barely remembered your name. My knees were giving out and my back felt older than my dad's. So when I got laid off in late spring of 2019, I didn't look for new work right away. I took it as a sign. I had a bit of money saved, not a lot, but enough to float for a few months if I lived cheap. A guy I knew, Rick, used to hunt in northern Wisconsin, and he told me about a place he'd stayed in, an old hunting cabin near Lac View Desert, barely an hour from the Michigan border. He said it was rustic, had no cell service, and nobody went near it after the snow melted because there wasn't much game around. It belonged to a friend of his uncle's or something. He said I could probably rent it for next to nothing if I called the owner directly. So I did. The guy didn't care much. He said if I wanted to give him $400 for the month and not burn it down, the key was under a cement frog by the door. So I packed up my old blue Tacoma with canned food, fishing gear, some tools, and a couple of paperbacks. I didn't bring a laptop. No internet. That was the point. I was going to go off the grid for a while. Just get away from all the noise. I drove up in early June. It took me almost 8 hours from my apartment in Madison. I'd never been that far north before, and the last hour of driving was nothing but trees. The paved roads turned into cracked gravel, and eventually into what felt like trails. I passed a few old houses that looked like no one had lived in them since the 90s. Faded mailboxes with names I couldn't pronounce, old trucks rusting into the earth. The cabin was farther out than I thought. It wasn't even marked. I had to turn off onto a trail that was barely wide enough for my truck. The trees were so close they brushed the sides as I drove in. When I finally got there, it was smaller than I expected. One story, maybe 20 feet wide. It had a screened porch out front and a metal chimney sticking up from the back like a bent finger. The woods around it were thick and alive. The kind of alive that's almost loud. Insects, birds, whined through leaves. I liked it immediately. I found the frog, got the key, and opened the door. The inside smelled like wood smoke and old leather. There was one big room with a stone fireplace, a dusty green couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a kitchen area with a propane stove and a dented fridge that didn't work. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom with no mirror and a dry toilet I'd have to empty into a compost bin outside. There was a small window in the bedroom that looked out toward the woods behind the cabin. I set my bags down, cracked a beer, and sat on the porch. The only sounds were birds, the creak of trees, and the distant buzzing of bugs. No cars, no people. It was perfect. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings fishing at a small stream I'd found about a half-mile from the cabin. I'd pack a sandwich, bring a folding chair, and sit by the water for hours. I didn't catch much, but I didn't care. I wasn't there for that. I'd read a lot, took naps, cooked beans and rice on the propane stove. Once or twice, I saw deer in the distance, and one morning I spotted a black bear, just lumbering across the path, not bothering with me. I kept my food sealed tight after that. By the second week, though, things started to shift a little. Not anything big, not at first. Just small details that didn't feel right. The first thing was the footprints. There was a clearing out behind the cabin, maybe 30 feet from the back door. I used it as a spot to dump compost and trash. One morning, I walked out there with a bucket of food scraps, and I saw boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. These were deep, with a square heel and a thick tread. I wore sneakers or sandals every day, nothing that would leave a print like that. And these were fresh, pressed into the damp earth like someone had walked through just that morning. I looked around, called out once, but of course there was no answer. Just trees and brush. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the property. There wasn't any fence or anything, but I figured maybe someone had been hiking. It was public land past a certain point. Still, it didn't sit right. I didn't sleep well that night. The next few days were quiet again. I tried to forget about it. Then on Thursday, I went to grab one of my tackle boxes from under the porch, and it was gone. I was sure I'd put it back. I remembered placing it beside the bucket with extra fishing line. Now it was just gone. I thought maybe I'd left it by the stream, but when I walked down there, nothing. I checked all around the cabin. Nothing. I kept my truck locked, but I checked that too. Nothing. Now I started to get that feeling. You know, the one. Like someone's been in your space. Like the air has changed and doesn't belong to you anymore. That night, I sat up late, reading on the porch with a lantern. I kept listening for sounds, for movement. A few times I thought I heard something. Sticks cracking, a low shuffle in the trees, but it could have been anything. Could have been a raccoon. Could have been the wind. But the next morning, I found something that made it all feel real. On the window outside the bedroom, on the outside, was a greasy handprint. Full-sized, right in the center of the glass. Like someone had leaned forward and pressed their palm flat against it. 5 fingers, smudged with dirt or oil. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I hadn't seen or heard a single car since I got there. No visitors, no neighbors, no reason anyone would be out here. It was too far, too hidden. Whoever left that handprint knew I was here. They'd come up close to the cabin. They'd looked inside. That day, I cleaned the rifle I'd brought. I'd only used it once for target practice, but now I loaded it and kept it beside the bed. I didn't sleep well again. Every sound outside made me sit up, heart pounding. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. I didn't go to the stream anymore. I stayed close. I kept the doors locked. I peered out the windows before stepping outside. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker, some random weirdo passing through. But then came the worst night. It started like any other. I ate dinner, just beans and eggs, and sat on the porch until the sun dipped low. The light in the woods went orange, then blue, then gone. I went inside and locked the door. I turned off all the lights and laid in bed with the rifle beside me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. No loud sound, no dream. Just that sharp, silent kind of waking where your brain tells you something's wrong. The window was open. I never opened that window. It was small, hard to crank, and didn't have a screen. But now it was cracked open an inch, just wide enough to let in cold air. I sat up in bed and stared. The moonlight made the room glow pale blue. My heart thudded like a drum. and then I saw movement, a shape just outside. Not a face, not a clear figure, just something there, low and hunched, like someone crouched beside the cabin wall, just beneath the window, waiting, listening. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat frozen, staring at that inch of black space between the window and the frame. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. After what felt like forever, the shape shifted. It stood slowly, like someone pushing up from a crouch. And then it moved away. I didn't hear it walk. I just saw the shadow slide out of view. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink, I think. I sat up until morning, holding the rifle, eyes locked on that window. When it was finally light, I walked outside. There were more prints in the dirt now. Not just in the clearing, *right* outside the window. Deep and messy, same boots. And on the side of the cabin, scratched into the wood with something sharp, was a line. Just a single horizontal gouge, as long as my arm, carved low into the wall, like someone had dragged a knife or a key straight across it. That was it for me. I packed that day, shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't care about cleaning. I didn't care about the trash. I just needed to get out. I didn't even go back to lock the door. I drove until I hit the main road, then farther until I had bars on my phone again. I pulled over in front of a gas station and just sat there, letting my hands stop shaking. I didn't report it. What could I say? That someone was near my cabin? That I saw a shape in the night? There was no proof, no faces, no names. Just tracks and a handprint. I never went back. Later, I told Rick what happened. He said the owner of the cabin didn't want to hear about it. Said the guy was old, didn't care, probably wouldn't even fix the window. That was 6 years ago. Sometimes I still dream about that window, about the inch of open space and the shape crouched outside. I still lock every door and check every window, even if I'm just going to bed in my apartment. I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from people. But the thing is, you never really know who's out there. You think It was late September when I decided to take that camping trip. The kind of trip that was meant to be peaceful, a chance to disconnect from everything for a few days. No phones, no distractions, just me, nature, and the simple quiet of the woods. I was 28, living in a small town in Michigan, working a desk job that had started to wear on me. I'd been to this forest before, but only on day hikes. This time, I wanted to camp. I wanted to experience the full thing. Setting up a tent, cooking over a fire, and being out there in the quiet. Maybe I needed a break more than I realized, or maybe I was just tired of the noise of everyday life. Either way, I packed my gear, got in my truck, and drove a couple of hours to a place called Big Pines National Forest. I pulled up to the parking lot at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. It was colder than I expected for September, and the trees were starting to turn, their leaves showing off a little early autumn color. I could already smell the earthy, pine-scented air that I loved so much, and for a moment, I felt at peace. The trail I was heading to was a loop that stretched about 8 miles, and the campsite was right on a small creek. It was a popular spot for people who wanted to get away but still be close enough to civilization if they needed it. I knew it wouldn't be completely isolated, but that didn't matter. I was looking for solitude, not total isolation. I started the hike around 4 p.m., trying to pace myself. The trail wasn't difficult, mostly flat, and it wasn't long before I was deep into the forest, the canopy of trees overhead blocking out most of the sun. The air was cool but not cold, and with every step, I felt more and more disconnected from the hustle and bustle of the world. This was exactly what I needed. By the time I reached the campsite around 6 p.m., the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The spot was perfect, an open clearing next to the creek, with a fire ring already in place and a few logs set up as benches. I dropped my backpack on the ground, relieved to have made it. I set up my tent first, securing the stakes into the damp earth, then gathered some firewood from the pile nearby. The creek babbled gently behind me, and the sound was soothing. I started the fire without much trouble, something I was familiar with from my occasional camping trips. The flames crackled and popped, and the warmth spread through the cool evening air. I took out a can of chili and heated it over the fire, the smell of food mixing with the pine scent around me. As I sat there, eating and watching the fire dance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. This was exactly what I had needed. It wasn't long before the sun finally set, leaving the forest in a twilight haze. The stars began to appear one by one, slowly filling the sky with their cold, distant light. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows around the clearing. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of the leaves in the trees. I felt completely alone, but not in a bad way, just alone enough to be free of everything that had been weighing on my mind. As the night deepened, I started to feel that familiar sense of unease that sometimes comes with being out in the wilderness. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but more like a heightened awareness. The forest had a life of its own, and while it was beautiful, it also reminded you that you were a visitor here. This wasn't home, and the longer you stayed, the more you realized how small and fragile you were in comparison to the world around you. I tossed another log on the fire, and as the flames flared up, I thought I saw something move at the edge of the clearing. It was quick, almost too quick to register, but I definitely saw it. Just a flash of movement, like something had darted between the trees. It wasn't a bear. I knew what they looked like from past encounters. This was smaller, more like a person's shape, but moving at a pace that seemed too fast for a human. I froze, watching the spot where I thought I saw it, but nothing else moved. The shadows played tricks in the firelight, and after a minute, I convinced myself it was nothing more than the wind shifting through the branches. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was one of those instincts you can't quite explain, like the hairs on the back of your neck standing up when you feel someone watching you. I couldn't decide if it was just my imagination or something more. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe the darkness, but whatever it was, I started to feel more aware of every noise around me. The wind, the crackling fire, the occasional snap of a branch. Even the sound of the creek seemed louder now. I finished my dinner quickly and decided to turn in early. The night had a strange energy to it, and I figured a good night's sleep would help clear my head. I slipped into my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and settled in, leaving the fire to burn out on its own. The air inside the tent was cool but not uncomfortable, and soon enough, I drifted off to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the first thing I noticed was the silence. The usual forest noises had stopped. No rustling leaves, no wind, nothing. I lay still, listening, but all I could hear was my own breath. It was the kind of silence that made everything feel too quiet. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps on the ground outside the tent. My heart skipped a beat, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. It wasn't the noise of an animal like a deer or a raccoon. It was too deliberate, too controlled. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call out? Should I confront whoever was out there? I didn't know if it was a person, but the possibility made my skin crawl. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise, and switched it on. The beam of light flickered in the dark, casting shadows inside the tent. Another crunch, this time closer. I froze, holding my breath again, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped, and for what felt like an eternity, everything was still. Too still. I couldn't move. I didn't know if I was being watched or if I was just overthinking it, but every instinct I had told me that something wasn't right. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was nothing, I heard a voice. It was faint, muffled by the fabric of the tent, but it sounded like it was coming from the other side. I held my breath again. The voice sounded strange, almost like it was whispering, but not to me. It wasn't a normal whisper, though. It felt off, like it was trying to stay hidden. The voice faded away, and the footsteps started again. This time retreating, moving further back into the woods. My pulse was racing now. Whoever or whatever had been out there was leaving, but the dread didn't leave with it. I waited in silence for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, and everything was still. Too still. I checked my gear, checked the perimeter, but I couldn't find anything. No signs of anyone or anything having been there, just the normal sounds of the forest slowly creeping back in. I didn't know what had happened, but whatever it was gone. I stayed up the rest of the night, too unsettled to sleep, keeping the fire going and the flashlight close. When morning finally came, I packed up my things quickly. The sun was up, the forest was quiet again, and I felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. I had no idea who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back here again. I hiked out of the woods as quickly as I could, my heart still racing. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I drove away without a second thought, the woods now a memory I'd never shake. I was 32 the summer I decided to go camping alone in the Lake District. It wasn't something I planned far in advance. I just quit a job I hated, ended a long-term relationship, and felt this pressure building inside me. Like I needed to be away from noise, people, expectations, somewhere I could just breathe. So, I packed up my gear, loaded my old Renault Clio, and drove north from my flat in Birmingham, with only a rough idea of where I was heading. I didn't tell many people I was going, just left a message with my younger brother, told him I'd be out of signal for a few days. That was it. The weather was decent for late August, overcast, cool, but dry. I wasn't after sunshine anyway. I was after silence. After about 6 hours of driving, stopping once to fuel up and get a sandwich, I reached Windermere. I'd been there once as a kid on a family trip, but didn't remember much besides boat rides and fudge shops. I didn't stick around in town. I kept going, further along a narrow road that wrapped around the lake, then took a sidetrack that led up into a wooded slope. I'd read somewhere online that wild camping was tolerated as long as you were respectful. Keep away from farms, clean up after yourself, don't make fires. That suited me fine. By early evening, I found a spot that felt right. It wasn't far from the lake, but just high enough to give me a bit of a view through the trees. The area was a mix of pine and birch, with the ground covered in thick moss and old needles. There was no one else around. I pitched my tent on a slight rise where the ground was dry and flat, laid out my sleeping bag, and set up a little portable gas stove to heat up some tin stew. The air was cool, but not cold, and I remember feeling a kind of deep relief as I sat there eating from the can, just hearing the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. That first night passed quietly. I didn't sleep great, but that was usual for the first night out. Every rustle outside the tent makes your ears perk up. Around midnight, I heard something. Maybe a badger or a fox moving nearby, but nothing came close. It wasn't frightening, just part of being out there. I drifted off sometime after 1 a.m. and woke up to pale light creeping through the tent fabric. The second day, I hiked around without any clear plan. There was a small trail running east from where I'd camped, so I followed that for a few hours. It led through thick woods and eventually opened up into a clearing with views of the fells. I didn't see a single person all day. I took a lot of photos, moss-covered trees, weird fungi, some old stone wall half swallowed by the forest. I'd packed sandwiches and fruit, so I ate while sitting on a stump, just watching the trees. Something about the quiet made everything feel heavier. Not in a bad way, just more real. I headed back to camp around 4, with enough daylight to get a small pot of tea going on the stove. The only thing that nagged at me a bit was that I had this odd feeling I wasn't totally alone. I hadn't heard or seen anyone, but once or twice while walking, I'd stopped because I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Always faint, always stopping when I stopped. But then again, the woods are full of weird echoes. I went to bed early that night, right after the sun went down. I remember listening to a podcast on my phone, something about missing hikers in Canada. It was a dumb idea. I turned it off halfway through because it was messing with my head. Around 10, the forest outside started to really come alive. Crickets, some owls, and other noises I couldn't place. I zipped up the tent, tucked into my sleeping bag, and tried to calm my mind. Somewhere around 1:30 in the morning, I woke up. It wasn't a dream or needing the toilet. It was that full-body kind of wake-up that happens when your brain decides something isn't right. I stayed still, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the wind moving through the canopy. Then, faintly, I heard what sounded like leaves crunching. Slow, measured, like footsteps, human ones, not animals scurrying. These were heavier, deliberate, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the tent. I held my breath. They stopped. For maybe a minute, maybe more. I stayed frozen, staring up at the roof of the tent. I was sure I was alone out there. Who the hell would be walking through the woods in the middle of the night? There were no proper trails around here, no campgrounds. The nearest car park was a couple miles away. My tent was camouflaged green. It would have been hard to spot unless someone already knew where it was. I kept lying there, barely breathing. Then the sound started again. Just a few steps, then nothing. I sat up as quietly as I could and reached for the small hatchet I'd brought along. It was more for chopping kindling, but in that moment it felt like the only thing I had. I unzipped the tent a few inches, slowly, trying not to make noise, and looked out. Nothing. Pitch black except for the faint outline of trees under the moonlight. The crunching had stopped. I stayed like that for over an hour, just listening. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been a deer, maybe a badger. I zipped the tent closed again and laid down, gripping the hatchet tight. I woke up to birdsong and pale light. Everything looked peaceful again. But that feeling didn't go away. I checked the area around the tent. Nothing looked disturbed. No prints in the moss. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I boiled some water for tea, but I didn't feel hungry. Every time I looked at the treeline, I expected to see someone watching. The woods felt different that morning, like they were holding their breath. I decided I'd pack up and head back down to the car. Maybe drive to a proper campsite. One with people. I started breaking down the tent and stowing my gear, trying not to rush but definitely moving faster than normal. I was about halfway done when I saw something caught on a branch about 20 feet from the edge of the clearing. It was a small plastic wrapper, bright red, some sort of candy wrapper, not mine. I walked over to it. It was wedged into a split branch about shoulder height. I took it and turned it over in my hand. The back was faded, but I could see a best before date from the previous year. It wasn't new, but it wasn't old enough to have just blown in from a storm. Someone had to have left it there, and the way it was caught, almost neatly slotted into the branch, it didn't look like the wind had done that. I kept packing, quicker now. That knot in my stomach had returned. I had this image in my head of someone watching me pack up, hiding behind a tree just out of sight. I didn't see or hear anything else, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps from the night before. I was just finishing up when I noticed something else. Along the edge of the clearing, maybe 10 feet from where I'd set up the tent, the moss had been scraped up. A long, narrow line, like someone had dragged something heavy, or maybe a stick. It led from the tree line to a spot not far from my stove setup. I left then, didn't even bother with a final check. I stuffed the last of my gear into the pack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking. No music.
No distractions.
Just walking fast down the way I'd come. I didn't stop to take photos or admire the view. I just wanted out. Took me over an hour to get back to the car. When I got there, I found something else that stopped me cold. The driver's side mirror was tilted inwards. I never do that. I always leave it positioned so I can just hop in and go. It was a small thing. Maybe a branch hit it, maybe an animal bumped it. But it felt like someone had been there. I drove the whole way back to Birmingham without stopping, except once for fuel. I didn't sleep properly for days after. I kept checking my windows at night, kept thinking about those footsteps, that wrapper, the scrape in the moss. I never reported anything. What would I have said? No one threatened me. Nothing was stolen. There was no proof of anything. Just a growing feeling that someone had been watching me. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who maybe had been in those woods longer than I had. I haven't been camping alone since. I still go hiking, still get out into the woods, but I stick to places where there are other people. Places with cameras and toilets and signs telling you where to go. Because the truth is, the scariest thing out there isn't ghosts or monsters. It's people. People who live in the margins, who don't follow the same rules, who might see someone like me, alone and quiet in the woods, as an opportunity. And if I hadn't woken up that night, if I hadn't listened, if I hadn't left when I did, I don't like to think about how close I might have come to finding out exactly what kind of person that was. I was 32 when I rented that cabin. It was early November 2019. I had just quit my job at a roofing company in Allentown, Pennsylvania, after a stupid argument with the supervisor. He blamed me for damage on a site I wasn't even on. I'd been dealing with that kind of crap for years, and that day something inside just gave out. I tossed my hard hat on the truck seat, clocked out, and never went back. I didn't really have a plan. I had maybe $5,000 saved up, no wife or kids to worry about. My brother tried to talk me into staying with him and his girlfriend in Lancaster for a while, but I didn't want to be a burden or sit on a couch feeling useless. I needed to get out, be alone, clear my head, so I searched online for cabins for rent. Not resorts or anything fancy, just a plain, private place out in the sticks. I ended up finding a listing on some forum. It wasn't even a proper website. This guy named Ron posted that he had an old hunting cabin near Clinton County, about 20 miles outside of a town called Renovo, and he was willing to rent it out for cheap during the off-season. It was rough, no running water, no electricity, just a generator and a propane heater. No cell service either, but I liked the idea of being cut off from everything. I messaged him, wired half the money up front, and got directions to the place. He mailed me an old-fashioned paper map with a hand-drawn route marked in red. That should have been the first red flag. The drive up was beautiful. 2-lane roads winding through hills and dead forests. Leaves were mostly off the trees, and everything had that quiet, gray tone. The kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. Took me almost 4 hours from Allentown. I followed Ron's map exactly, and I found the dirt path he marked after a long stretch past a gas station that looked closed for the season. The dirt road was narrow and full of potholes. My old Ford Ranger shook like hell going up. After about 15 minutes of crawling through the woods, I saw it, the cabin. It was set in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by thick forest. No signs of other people, no tire tracks except mine. The roof sagged in the middle. The siding was dark wood, cracked in places, and there was a small chimney poking out of one side. A rusted metal shed sat about 30 feet to the right. There was no lock on the cabin door, just a wooden bar you could slide into place from the inside. I stepped in and looked around. There was one room, a cot, a small table with 2 folding chairs, a wood stove in the corner, and some old shelves stacked with canned food and matches. A 5-gallon water jug sat by the wall. Everything smelled like dust and mildew. I unpacked my stuff, just some clothes, a few tools, a bunch of bottled water, and a cooler with food, and set up the cot. There was a little solar lantern on the table, and the generator sat outside behind the shed. I didn't turn it on. I didn't need power just yet. I lit a couple candles, opened a can of beans, and ate straight from the tin. That first night was quiet. The wind rattled the windows now and then, and I heard a few branches snap in the woods, but nothing that really got to me. I didn't sleep great, but I wasn't scared either. Just felt off. I figured it was the isolation. I told myself I'd feel better in the morning. The next few days were mostly the same. I chopped some firewood from a fallen tree nearby, stacked it against the side of the cabin. I spent hours walking through the woods, just trying to kill time. There were no trails, and the forest felt dense and untouched. Every now and then I'd see animal tracks or droppings, but I never spotted anything larger than a squirrel. The weirdness started around day 4. I had gone about a mile into the woods to check out a small stream I found on the second day. I liked the sound of running water. It gave the place a bit of life. But that day, the stream was gone. I swear it. The rocks were there, still wet, but no water. It was like someone turned off a faucet. I stood there for a while, staring at the empty bed, trying to figure it out. Maybe it was seasonal, I thought. Maybe it dried up sometimes. I shrugged it off and headed back to the cabin. But I couldn't find the path. I had been using broken twigs and small stacks of rocks to mark my way back, but they were gone. I retraced my steps, or tried to, but nothing looked right. Every direction looked the same, just trees and more trees. I didn't panic at first. I had a compass in my jacket. I pulled it out, turned west like I always did, and walked for about an hour. When I saw the cabin again, I almost cried. Not from fear, just relief. I didn't like how fast that turned into something deeper, something colder. That night, I didn't light any candles. I just lay there on the cot, eyes open, listening. The wind had stopped. Total silence. Not even bugs. Sometime past midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow ones. Not crunching leaves. More like pressing against them. Like someone trying to walk quiet. I sat up, heart pounding, grabbed the hatchet I kept near the cot. I didn't breathe. The steps circled the cabin. One loop, then nothing. I waited an hour before I moved. I pressed my face to the window but saw only black trees. No flashlight, no sounds, just trees. Next morning, I walked the entire perimeter of the cabin. No prints, no broken branches, nothing to prove anyone had been there. I tried to radio for help that day. I had a little emergency CB radio in my truck. I climbed in, tried every channel. Static. I turned on the truck and considered driving out, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. Maybe I thought I was just getting in my own head. The isolation was messing with me. That night, the generator started by itself. I hadn't touched it in days. It was an old pull-start Honda model. No electric start, no timer. Just suddenly roaring to life behind the shed. I bolted outside with the hatchet. No one there. No footprints. I shut it off and rolled it into the cabin. That thing was heavy, must have been 90 pounds. I locked it inside with me. Next morning, I found all the canned food open and dumped on the floor. Not eaten, just opened and emptied. Clean slices down the side of each tin like someone used a proper opener. My opener was still on the shelf. I packed everything, tossed it all in the truck and started driving down the dirt road. About half a mile in, the path was blocked. A tree had fallen. I got out, checked it. It hadn't rotted or snapped in the wind. It was cut, clean through like with a saw. I hadn't heard any chainsaws or engines. I would have. I backed up, turned around, tried a different route I had seen on the map. It looked promising, just another dirt path heading east. But that ended in a ditch. No way around it. I went back to the cabin. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the table, lantern on, hatchet in one hand, flashlight in the other. I stared at the door. Nothing happened. No steps, no sounds. Just waiting. By the 6th day, I had started writing things down. Notes, times, locations. Trying to make sense of it. I found myself checking the same parts of the forest again and again. I left markings, deep ones. Chipped bark, tied bits of shirt fabric. Every time I walked back, they were gone. Like the woods were scrubbing themselves clean. I was running out of food. Only a few bottles of water left. I stopped trusting the jug in the cabin. The water tasted weird, like plastic and dirt. I thought about boiling it, but the stove wouldn't stay lit. It would catch, then die out, even with fresh kindling and paper. Day 8, I found footprints. Barefoot, human, small, almost child-sized, leading from the shed to the tree line. I followed them for 100 feet. Then they vanished. Not like someone turned around, just gone. I moved the cot in front of the door that night, slept with the hatchet across my chest. I dreamed of a face watching me from the window, but when I woke up, nothing was there. On day 10, I tried walking straight west again. I made it farther than before, about 3 miles, I think. I climbed a small ridge and saw something in the distance. A clearing and what looked like a road. Real road. Asphalt. I ran, sprinting through brush, thorns ripping my pants, branches slapping my face. But when I got to the clearing, it was just more woods. No road, just a shadow playing tricks. I screamed, loud, over and over. My throat felt raw. I didn't care who heard me. I slept in the truck that night, windows up, doors locked. When I woke up, there were smudges on the passenger side window. Handprints, not full ones, just greasy smears like someone leaned against the glass. That morning, the key to the cabin was gone. I had left it in the ignition, nowhere to be found. The door was wide open. Inside, every item was stacked in the center of the room, neatly. My bags, the lantern, the stove, even the empty cans, like someone had made a little shrine. That broke me. I left everything, grabbed my wallet, My name's Eric. I'm 34 years old, and this happened back in late October 2019. At the time, I was working as a freelance graphic designer, mostly staying home and handling everything online. That kind of freedom let me get away from the city sometimes, especially when things got overwhelming. I'd just come off a string of tight deadline projects, barely sleeping or eating properly, and my head felt like it was full of static. I needed out. So, I rented a cabin in upstate Maine through a small site that specialized in off-grid getaways. It wasn't some luxury Airbnb cabin with Wi-Fi and fancy appliances. It was real old school. Wood stove for heat, no electricity, no plumbing beyond a basic pump for cold water. One room, a small kitchen area, and a loft bed. The place sat near the edge of a forest preserve, with no other homes or cabins for at least 5 or 6 miles. It was exactly what I needed. At least that's what I thought going in. I drove up early in the morning from Boston. The last stretch of the road was narrow and unpaved, more of a gravel trail cutting through thick woods than anything else. The trees were mostly bare, just clinging to a few orange and yellow leaves. It had rained the day before, so the dirt road was slick and soft in places. My little SUV wasn't exactly built for that, but I managed. When I got there, I found the cabin just like the owner had described. Tiny, grayish-brown, built low to the ground, and tucked into a slight clearing that opened up into dense woods. The driveway just kind of ended at the edge of a sloped patch of land where the cabin sat. There was a narrow path off to the right, barely wide enough to walk through, that looked like it led deeper into the forest. I made a mental note to avoid that. Hiking alone out here wasn't the smartest idea. I got the key from under a loose rock near the front door, opened up, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like dry wood and dust. It wasn't dirty, just old. The kind of old where the floorboards creak no matter where you step, and the windows rattle if there's even a light breeze. The place had a sort of rustic charm, and after unloading my bags and lighting a fire in the stove, I felt myself start to relax for the first time in weeks. The first couple of days were uneventful. I'd wake up with the sun, make coffee on the propane burner, and spend hours sitting on the small porch with a blanket over my legs, watching the wind move through the trees. No phone signal, no distractions, just the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the occasional creaking of trees. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I welcomed it. It was on the 4th day that things started to feel off. I woke up around 6 a.m., just before dawn. The air inside the cabin was freezing, so I got the fire going right away. While I waited for the place to warm up, I stepped outside to take a leak. It had rained again during the night, and everything was damp. The sky was overcast, casting a grayish light over everything. I noticed something strange as I stood on the porch. There were footprints in the mud. Not mine, they were too big and had a different tread pattern than my hiking boots. They came from the direction of the narrow trail, stopped about 10 feet from my porch, then turned and went back the way they came. I stood there for a long time just staring. The tracks weren't fresh, maybe a few hours old at most, but still, someone had walked right up to my cabin in the middle of the night and left without knocking or announcing themselves. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hunter got turned around? Maybe someone from the preserve came out to check the area? But there was no reason to come that close and then leave without making contact. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping busy. I read, jotted some notes in my journal, and made simple meals. But I kept checking the window, glancing toward that trail. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to some creak or soft thump outside. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard crunching, like someone walking slowly across wet leaves. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and held my breath. The sound didn't come again, but I stayed awake until the sun came up, just listening. The next morning, I went outside and scanned the area around the cabin. I didn't see anything at first, but when I walked around the back, I found more footprints. Same size, same tread. They circled behind the cabin and stopped about 5 feet from the back wall, then disappeared into the trees. That's when I decided I needed to get out of there. Maybe not that second, but soon. I didn't want to wait until something worse happened. I packed up most of my stuff, loaded the car, and planned to leave the next morning. I'd already paid for the full week, but I didn't care anymore. That night, I kept the fire low so the light wouldn't be visible from outside. I sat in the dark, wide awake, holding the small hatchet the owner had left next to the woodpile. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. Not fast, not loud, just slow, deliberate steps on wet ground. I turned off the small battery lantern I had on and moved to the window. I couldn't see much through the glass, just the outline of trees and darkness beyond them. But then something moved. A figure, just barely visible. They were standing a few feet from the tree line, not moving, just watching the cabin. My stomach dropped. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark shape. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stood there, staring through the glass, waiting for them to do something. But they didn't. After what felt like forever, they turned and walked back into the woods. I waited until daylight before I moved. I grabbed my last few things, tossed them into the car, and got out of there. The trail out was even more of a mess after the rain, and I nearly got stuck twice, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to a place with people. On the way out, I stopped at a small gas station about 20 miles from the cabin. The guy behind the counter looked like he'd been working there his whole life. I asked him casually if there were a lot of hunters in the area. He gave me a strange look and said hunting wasn't allowed anywhere near that stretch of woods. It was a protected zone. I asked if anyone else lived nearby, or if there were rangers or staff who might check on the place. He shook his head and told me the preserve didn't really get visitors. Too remote, he said. Too much wildlife, not enough trails. Most people avoided it. I didn't tell him about the footprints or the figure in the woods. I just nodded, paid for gas, and drove home. It's been years now, and I haven't been back to Maine since. I still don't know who or what that person was. Maybe some drifter living off the grid. Maybe someone hiding out. Or maybe just some local messing with me. I'll never know. But one thing still bothers me. I didn't notice it at first, not until a few weeks later when I was going through the photos I'd taken at the cabin. I'd snapped a picture of the porch on the second day, the morning after I arrived. Just a casual shot of the trees and the path leading off into the woods. When I zoomed in, way in the background, almost hidden behind a tree, was a figure, standing still, watching. I was 29 when I decided to take some time off and go on a solo retreat. Life in Cincinnati had become too much. I was working as a systems analyst at a mid-sized company that had just been acquired, and everything felt like it was falling apart. Layoffs, budget cuts, too many meetings. I was burned out. It was early October 2013. I booked a small, private cabin up in northern Michigan, near a tiny place called Crystal Hill, which wasn't much more than a couple of gas stations, a diner, and a bait shop. The cabin was about 8 miles off the main road, surrounded by woods thick enough to swallow all sound. It belonged to a guy I found through a small travel site. He only rented it out in the fall when his hunting season ended. Said it was best for people who wanted peace and quiet. It didn't have Wi-Fi, barely had cell service, no television, just a wood stove, a gas heater, a radio, and enough supplies for a couple weeks. I brought a stack of books, my camera, some old trail maps, and a big notebook to write in. The idea was to unplug, recharge, maybe even figure out if I wanted to quit my job entirely. The first 2 days were perfect. Cold air, orange leaves, the kind of silence you can feel in your bones. I chopped wood in the morning, read by the window in the afternoons, and slept for 10 hours at a time. The only noise was the occasional gust of wind and the crunch of squirrels or deer in the underbrush. The cabin was small, just one room with a little kitchen off to the side, a wood stove in the middle, and a cot against the wall. The front had a porch that looked out over a slope of trees. There was no real backyard, just more woods. It was isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. The first strange thing happened on the third night. I'd gone to bed around 10. The stove was burning low, and I'd cracked a window because the heat had gotten dry and stale. I remember waking up because of a sound, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. It was a click, then a sort of dragging sound, like metal on wood. I sat up in bed. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or something getting into the firewood I'd stacked by the side of the porch. I didn't go outside. I waited, listened. It stopped after maybe a minute. I told myself it was nothing, just forest noises. Maybe a branch fell. But I left the window closed that time and kept the hatchet I used for firewood inside from then on. The next morning, I went out to check. The woodpile was fine, nothing disturbed. I walked around the cabin, but didn't see anything odd. I shook it off. The fifth night was colder. I layered up before bed and made sure the fire was good and strong. Around midnight, I woke up again. Same sound, a click, then dragging, but this time it was closer, definitely outside, right outside the cabin wall. I sat still, listening. My heart was pounding in my ears. The dragging went on for maybe 30 seconds, then silence. I didn't hear footsteps, just that weird scrape. In the morning, I found something I didn't expect. Just under the window, the one I'd opened 2 nights before, there were marks in the dirt. Not footprints, more like lines, like someone had dragged a stick or a piece of metal along the ground. It curved around the side of the cabin, disappearing into the woods. That was the first time I started to feel real fear. Not full-on panic, but the kind that sits in your chest and makes you hyper-aware of every creak and crack. I told myself again it was an animal, maybe a porcupine, maybe a coyote dragging something. I didn't let myself think about anything else, but I started keeping the hatchet under the cot. That day, I went hiking along the trail behind the cabin. I needed to clear my head. It was an old trail, barely used and covered in fallen leaves. I walked for maybe an hour, following it until it started looping back. The trees were beautiful. I tried to relax. On the way back, maybe 200 yards from the cabin, I found something strange in the woods. It was a pile of rocks, stacked deliberately, not naturally, about waist-high. In the middle of it was a tin can, crushed flat. Next to it was an old boot, just one. It looked like it had been there a long time. It didn't make sense. There were no other cabins nearby, no campsites, no trash, just this weird little pile, almost like a marker. I took a photo and walked back fast. That night I didn't sleep. The noise came again. Click, drag, click, drag. I sat on the cot with my jacket on and the hatchet across my lap. I didn't look out the window. I didn't move. At 2:43 a.m., there was a knock on the back wall. Not the door, the wall. 3 slow, heavy knocks, like someone using the side of their fist or a piece of wood. Not testing it, just letting me know they were there. Then silence. The next morning, I found another set of drag marks. This time, they came all the way around the cabin and ended at the steps of the front porch. There was no knock on the door, just the back wall. I didn't have cell reception strong enough to call anyone. I tried texting a friend to come pick me up early, but it didn't send. The signal kept cutting out. I stood on the roof of the porch holding the phone above my head for 10 minutes. Nothing. I wanted to leave, but the guy who rented me the cabin had taken the only set of keys to the old truck that came with the place. He said it was an anti-theft thing. If I needed to leave early, I'd have to call him. I couldn't even start the truck without the key fob he had. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to make it obvious I was awake. I kept the inside dark, lay in bed with my boots on, holding the hatchet. No knocks this time, but I heard movement. Something brushing against the front door. Something heavy. Then the sound of metal scraping wood again. But this time, it was coming from the roof. Something or someone had climbed on top of the cabin. I stayed completely still. I could hear the creak of the old boards above me, the shifting of weight, then a dull thud, and then nothing. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun rose, I walked around the cabin with my camera. I took photos of everything, the scrape marks, the boot print I found near the back wall, the edge of the roof. On one of the boards, I saw a line of small scratches, like a knife tip had traced it. I packed my stuff. I put everything in a pile by the door and waited. No one came. At noon, I took one of the old trail maps and started walking toward the main road. I had a compass. I figured if I walked fast, I could make it to the road by dark and flag someone down. I didn't want to be in the woods another night. I didn't make it to the road. About 4 miles in, I realized I was being followed. I don't know how long it had been happening. I wasn't making much noise, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. But at some point, I noticed the rhythm of twigs breaking behind me. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't step like that. It was slower, deliberate. I kept walking. I didn't run. I didn't want to show panic. But my hands were shaking. I had the hatchet in one, compass in the other. I kept looking back. At one point, I saw movement between the trees. Just a flash of someone ducking behind a trunk. Human height, pale jacket. That was all I saw. I changed direction, left the trail completely and moved fast through the brush. I tried to make a wide circle back to the cabin. I figured I'd take the truck, keys or not. I'd hotwire it or break a window or something. But when I got back near the cabin, I stopped. The front door was open. I hadn't left it that way. I crouched in the woods for a long time watching. There was no sound, no movement, but something was wrong. I felt it. Eventually, I moved slowly toward the back. I didn't go inside. I climbed into the bed of the truck, broke the back window with the hatchet and climbed in. Found the glove box. No key, of course, but there was a flare gun under the seat. I took it. I waited until nightfall. I sat in the truck with the flare gun in one hand and the hatchet in the other. I didn't go back inside the cabin. I didn't move. Around midnight, I saw movement again. Someone stepped out of the woods. They didn't come close, just stood there near the pile of firewood, watching. I couldn't see their face, just the shape of them. They didn't move for what felt like an hour. Then they walked around to the back of the cabin. I waited, listened. I could hear them on the porch. Then the scraping again, metal on wood, that same sound. I stepped out of the truck and fired the flare gun straight up. The light was blinding in the darkness. It lit up the trees, the side of the cabin, everything. No one was there. I ran. I didn't stop. I ran through the woods in the direction of the road, flare gun in one hand, compass bouncing on my chest. I didn't stop until I hit gravel. Around 3 a.m., a passing truck saw me and picked me up. The man who rented me the cabin said I must have scared off a bear, that the scratches were probably from raccoons, that I'd imagined the rest. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. A week later, police went out to check the property. They found the boot I saw, and they found something else. I had been planning this trip for months. A solo trip to a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from civilization, away from everything. I wanted complete solitude, just me, the trees, and the quiet. I had rented a small hunting cabin, miles away from any roads or towns. It was old but sturdy, with a wood-burning stove, a small bed, and a storage area for supplies. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. The drive to the closest parking area was long, miles of winding dirt roads. I parked in a clearing, locked up my truck, and checked my pack. I had all my gear, food, water, warm clothing, a rifle, and enough supplies for a week. The hike to the cabin was about 5 miles through dense forest, with no marked trails. I had a map and compass, but I had studied the area enough to navigate without much trouble. The first few miles were peaceful. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and the forest smelled of damp earth and pine. The only sounds were my boots crunching on leaves and the distant calls of birds. No signs of people, no signs of anything unusual, just the way I wanted it. When I reached the cabin, it looked just as I expected, small, weathered, isolated. There was a stack of firewood against the side, likely left by the last person who stayed here. The door was locked, just as the owner had said it would be. I pulled out the key, unlocked it, and stepped inside. The air was stale, untouched for weeks, maybe months. Dust covered the wooden floor, and a few cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. I set down my pack, stretched, and started setting up. I checked the small wood stove, making sure it was still in working order. The chimney was clear. I stacked some wood inside, ready for the night. The single window had a wooden shutter that could be latched from the inside. It wasn't much, but it would keep the wind out. By late afternoon, I had settled in. I chopped some more firewood, made a simple meal, and sat outside watching the trees. The silence was almost too much. No distant cars, no voices, just the wind through the branches. It was peaceful, but something about it made me uneasy. That night, I lit a fire, ate, and locked up. The inside of the cabin was warm, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls. As I lay in bed, I listened to the woods. At first, just the usual sounds: wind, creaking trees, the occasional rustle in the bushes. But then something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal. Too heavy. They stopped just outside the cabin. I held my breath, listening. No knocking, no attempt to open the door. Just silence. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep. The first light, I stepped outside. No signs of anything. No footprints. But I knew what I heard. Someone had been there. I spent the day checking the area. I walked a half-mile in each direction, looking for signs of a campsite or another cabin. Nothing. Just endless trees. That evening, I locked up again, kept my rifle close, and waited. Around midnight, the footsteps came back. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, steady. My heart pounded. I stayed completely still. Then, just as before, they faded into the distance. At sunrise, I packed up. I wasn't going to wait around to see who it was or what they wanted. I left nothing behind, locked up the cabin, and started hiking back. Halfway to my truck, I saw something that stopped me cold. A boot print, fresh, leading away from the direction of the cabin. Someone had been following me. I didn't stop moving. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear inside, locked the doors, and drove until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. Maybe it was just a hunter. Maybe it wasn't. But I wasn't about to find out. Some places are better left alone. I always loved getting away from everything, just shutting out the world for a few days. That was why I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town, far from people, far from anything. It was supposed to be peaceful, a way to relax and disconnect. But looking back, I wish I had never gone there. The cabin was old but solid. It was a one-room structure with a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a bed pushed against the far wall. The wooden floors creaked under my boots when I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke. There was no electricity, just a few old gas lamps hanging from the walls. It was exactly what I was looking for. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked my gear, set up a small fire outside, and made some food. The quiet was almost too much at first. No cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. I spent the evening sitting by the fire, eating, watching the sky darken. When the cold started creeping in, I went inside, locked the door, and settled in for the night. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something felt off. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but the air inside the cabin felt different, heavier somehow. I listened for a while, but all I could hear was the wind outside. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. They were deep, heavy prints, not the light tracks of an animal. Someone had been there, walking around while I slept. I felt a chill run through me. I wasn't alone out here. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I kept checking the tree line, expecting to see someone watching me, but there was no one. I tried to push the fear down, telling myself it was probably just some hunter passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin and got curious. That was possible, right? That night, I locked the door and set a chair against it. I kept my knife next to me, barely sleeping. Every little noise made me jump. The wind against the windows, the crackling of cooling wood. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I gripped my knife, staying as still as possible. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing, slow and steady. Whoever was out there was standing just on the other side of the wood. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Minutes passed. Then, just as silently as they had come, the footsteps moved away. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. When the sun came up, I packed my things and left without looking back. I never found out who was out there that night. I never went back to that cabin. Some places are meant to be left alone. I decided to go camping alone in a remote forest. I had always loved the quiet, the feeling of being completely disconnected from everything. The forest I chose was about 3 hours from the nearest town, deep in the mountains, and I had done enough research to know that hardly anyone went there. It was perfect, or at least that's what I thought. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, some food, a flashlight, a knife, and other essentials. I had been camping alone before, so I wasn't too worried about it. The plan was simple. Hike to a good spot by a small lake I had found on a map, set up camp, spend the night, and hike back in the morning. The trail was rough and overgrown, but I liked that. It meant fewer people had been through here. The hike was longer than I expected. The path was uneven, and I had to stop several times to catch my breath. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees when I finally reached the lake. It was beautiful, untouched. The water was still, reflecting the deep greens of the forest around it. There was no wind, no sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful in a way that made you feel small. I set up my tent a few feet from the water, gathered some wood, and got a small fire going. The night air was crisp, and I sat by the fire, eating a sandwich and watching the flames flicker. It was quiet, too quiet. That was the first thing that unsettled me. Usually, you could hear insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, maybe even a distant howl from a coyote. But there was nothing, just silence. I shook it off, convincing myself that it was just because I was in such a remote place. After finishing my meal, I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard, but I was tired from the hike, and sleep came quickly. I woke up in the middle of the night. It wasn't a slow wake-up. I was instantly alert, my heart pounding. Something was outside. I could hear movement, slow, deliberate steps crunching the leaves just beyond my tent. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. I strained to hear more, but there was only silence. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, but something about the way it moved didn't feel right. It wasn't the quick, skittish movements of a wild animal. It was slow, purposeful. I stayed still, waiting. A long time passed, and I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been nothing and forced myself back to sleep. Morning came, and everything seemed normal again. I unzipped my tent, stepping out into the cool morning air. The forest was still quiet, but the feeling from the night before was gone. I packed up my things, making sure I left no trace behind. Before leaving, I walked down to the lake to splash some water on my face. That's when I saw it. Across the lake, on the opposite shore, there were footprints. Human footprints. They led from the treeline to the water and then stopped. There was no sign of anyone camping over there. No indication that someone had walked away. Just the prints leading to the edge of the water. And then nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine. Someone had been there, watching me, maybe while I slept. I stood there for a long time, staring at those prints, trying to make sense of them. Then, without thinking, I grabbed my bag and started hiking out. I didn't run, but I moved fast. Every so often, I stopped and listened. The silence was heavier now, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The hike back felt longer than the hike in. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something, or someone, was behind me. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It stayed with me the whole way until I reached my car. I threw my gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away, back on the main road, civilization in sight. I never went back to that forest. I still think about those footprints sometimes, about the silence, about the slow, deliberate steps outside my tent. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I know that someone was out there, and they were watching me. I was looking for a break from my routine, something different from my usual weekends spent indoors. So I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had been camping before, mostly with friends, but this time I wanted the quiet, the isolation. I wanted to be away from the noise of the city, away from people. I planned everything carefully, packing my gear, making sure I had enough food, and choosing a remote spot deep in the forest. The place I picked was about 3 hours from where I lived. It was a lesser-known camping area, which meant fewer people, maybe none at all. That's what I wanted. I drove most of the way and then hiked the last few miles with my backpack. The path was narrow, surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No sounds of cars, no distant voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirping of birds. After a couple of hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a lake. It was perfect. The water was still, reflecting the trees around it. I set up my tent near the edge, just close enough to hear the water but far enough to be safe. The air smelled fresh, the kind of clean scent you only find deep in the woods. As the sun started to set, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The warmth of the flames felt comforting against the cool evening air. I sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude, watching the sky darken. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky. It was peaceful. I didn't feel scared or uneasy, just relaxed. At some point, I heard rustling in the bushes behind me. I assumed it was an animal. I had read about deer and small critters in the area. I ignored it, but the sound didn't stop. It wasn't the kind of rustling made by the wind or a small animal moving through leaves. It was slower, deliberate. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, scanning the area. Nothing, just darkness and the shapes of trees. I told myself it was nothing and went back to my fire. The noise stopped. It was probably my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you when you're alone. I stayed up for a while longer before deciding to sleep. I put out the fire and got into my tent. The forest was silent now, except for the occasional sound of insects. I closed my eyes, listening to the stillness. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was pitch black, my tent completely zipped up, but something felt wrong. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful, close. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was walking around my tent. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps circled my tent, stopping for long moments before continuing. They weren't heavy, but they weren't light either. Definitely human. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. My car was parked miles away, and this spot wasn't easy to find. The footsteps stopped directly in front of my tent. Just standing there, I could feel my breath shaking. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then the sound of fabric, someone pressing against my tent. I stayed frozen, gripping my knife so tight my hand ached. Then, after what felt like forever, the pressure disappeared. The footsteps started again, moving away this time. I waited, listening as they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed alert, listening to every sound. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped my tent slowly and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anyone. But I knew what I heard. I packed up my things as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I took down my tent. I didn't bother eating. I just wanted to leave. The hike back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like someone watching me. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I threw my gear inside and got in, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine, I took one last look at the trail. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the tree line, watching me. Too far to see clearly, but close enough that I knew it was a person. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there. I didn't wait. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the main road. I never went back to that place. I don't know who or what was out there with me that night, and I don't want to find out.